I'm Alan Borsick. I'm Senior Fellow in Law and Public Policy here, and I'm honored and eager for all of you to be here. And that said, I'm honored to introduce President Mike Lovell of Marquette University to say a few words of welcome.
Well, thank you, Alan, and I'm going to welcome all of you to Marquette University this morning. We're very pleased here at Marquette to have two of our academic units, our law school and our college education, to work together to help us all learn more about K through 12 education. Nelson Mandela once said that education was the most powerful weapon for changing the world. And so when you think of the issues facing Wisconsin and Milwaukee, I believe there's no more important topic for us to be talking about, because if we can make our K through 12 education system better, many of the ills that face Wisconsin and Milwaukee will be fixed. And I'm very pleased that we have so many high-quality participants here today to help our discussion along this dialogue. And to face the challenges we face, it's been decades that the educational system has increased the challenges. It's going to take a while to unwind them, and hopefully today we can start to come with some of the solutions to many of the problems that we want to overcome. And that being said, we are very pleased to have Tony Evers here today, who I get the opportunity to introduce. And Tony was elected as the State Superintendent of Public Instruction in 2009 and was reelected again in 2013. He has tirelessly worked for 3 decades in public education, starting as an educator in Tomah, Wisconsin. And if you follow K through 12 education, he seems to be everywhere within the state. I got the great opportunity to work with him as a colleague when I was at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, as he serves on the Board of Regents. And many, many of the important issues the state faces, Tony is at the forefront of trying to meet them. As a superintendent, he has steadfastly worked to transform Wisconsin's education system, and he has a vision that he's trying to realize every child a graduate, college, or career ready from our K through 12 system. Whether it be his work as superintendent or his work through Milwaukee Succeeds, which again I have the opportunity to work with him to help face the challenge of Milwaukee, he truly, truly cares about every student in the state and wants to help them be successful. He's a project of our state educational system. He graduated from Plymouth High School, and he earned 3 degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, including a doctoral degree in educational administration. So please help me welcome Tony Evers.
Well, thanks, Mike. We miss you on the other side of the interstate, but this is a great place for you, and thanks so much for all you do for Marquette and the kids of Milwaukee. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks, Alan, for, again, organizing these types of events. And since, obviously, looking at the agenda here today, there's no shortage of controversial issues facing public education. Today, we'll be talking about a lot of things: finance, testing, turnaround schools, so on and so forth. And since I'm not on any of those panels, I thought I would give you the small part, a few things that I think about each one of those. I talked about finance on Mike Boucher's show just the other night, and fortunately, the people of Wisconsin really have spoken on this issue, whether it's the Marquette poll or the St. Norbert's poll. 80% of the people in the state indicate that they feel that public education, public funding for education should not be cut for K through 12. And there's even a majority of folks that said they'd rather have their taxes increased than see funding decreased. So I think that's a great place to be. And our politicians, including me, need to understand what people of Wisconsin are talking about, and clearly they're talking about it in very specific terms. Now, where we're at legislatively is that even though we look like we are in a better place than we were a few weeks ago, the fact of the matter is a 0% increase is not going to do much for our schools. In fact, I would argue the message that's being sent there is that if you want to get ahead and you want your school, public school, to thrive, you need to go to referendum. And it's just my humble opinion that that's a canary in the mine, because even though I'm pleased as punch that 60, 70% of our schools are passing referendum, that means 20, 30, 40% are not. And if we rely on us going locally every 2 years to keep up, that's a recipe for a disaster. We'll soon have a state of haves and have-nots, and I think that's absolutely not within the concept of what the Wisconsin idea is all about. So that's my quick input on the finance piece. On testing, if I could summarize it, I would say we need stability in our testing. Do we test too much? Likely. Is our end of summative standardized test important? Absolutely. There's a reason that the NAACP and 26 other advocacy groups in the state in the country and in the state are advocating for annual tests. And annual tests, we can't oversell what they do, but they do tell us where our achievement gaps are. And that's a critically important thing for the state of Wisconsin. So we need stability. I believe regardless of how schools are funded, whether they're choice charter or traditional public schools, one test is the key there. And there's been a lot of talk about opt-outs, and frankly, I think that issue is a bit overblown. In the state of Wisconsin, we're testing right now, and I anticipate that the opt-outs will be minimal. So that's quick input on the testing piece. Turnaround schools. Even though, as you may have noticed in the on electronic media this morning, there's a proposal out there to have Chris Abley control schools in Milwaukee, MPS, kind of a turnaround district. And it's been tried elsewhere. We have to, I think, changing schools in a way that's significant and systemic. It takes hard work. It's not sexy stuff. It's not around turnaround. It's not around hiring and firing the right people. It's about hard work, making sure our teachers are culturally competent, making sure that adequate resources are in place, and looking for a silver bullet, I think, is a fool's errand. So the main question I'm asked as state superintendent is, how do you stand it? And I'm asked that a lot. In fact, I spent time this weekend with a lot of different people, and I bet you that question is asked to me lots of times. I can stand it because I love the job, and because we do some great things here in Wisconsin. We continue to be good in recognizing a number of ways. We're still good in ACT tests, advanced placement tests. We lead the Midwest in our accomplishments there. Our graduation rates are the highest in the country. Our reading and math scores are trending up. I'll give you a small example of closing the achievement gap, which is something that is a shame for our state. We have the largest achievement gap in the country. But then I was in Racine the other night honoring some teachers, and the Racine in the last previous 3 years, not counting this last year, but previous 3 years, closed the gap between African American kids and white kids by 13 points in 3 years. That's a lot. Last year they closed it 6 points. That's a lot. I mean, it's almost breathtaking. That's good information. It's the right way to move in the right direction. Also, a small example, and I think it's something we all should be proud of right here in Milwaukee, Alethea Tilford. Alethea is going to be an MPS grad in a few weeks, graduate from high school. She was recognized as a presidential scholar, one of 2 in the state of Wisconsin, one of 141 in the country. There's 3.3 million graduates from our schools, and there's 4,500 that are eligible for this award. Alethea made the first cut. I had the opportunity to nominate her. Actually, she introduced me at my State of Education speech last fall. And I knew then she was somebody special because I was afraid to come to the microphone after she was finished. Anyway, she made the cut down to 500, and she was selected MPS girl. MPS person, one of 2 in the state, one of 141 in the country, that will be going to meet with President Obama in early June and receive her Presidential Scholar Award. So that's the good news. Of course, we have lots of struggles going on in our schools, and of course, we need to make sure that we understand that the way we look at things in Wisconsin is through different lenses, and I get that. The choice program is well established in the state. Charters are well established in the state. Of course, our traditional public schools have been around for 100 years. But we need to move together as a nation, and we need to move together as a state, and this is a good opportunity today to do that. Now, if I had another concern to share with you, it's around the profession of teaching, and I believe that we have to be careful that we don't drive people out of the professions. I'm sure the enrollment in Marquette, probably School of Education, mirrors what it is nationally and within our state. Young people do not want to enter the profession, or they're not entering the profession at the same level as they did before. I think our teachers are extraordinarily resilient in the state. They are working under extraordinarily difficult conditions. They're doing great work, but resiliency only lasts so long. And I would suggest that Marquette consider in a very near future the next symposium could be titled, "Where have all the teachers gone, and now what are we going to do about that?" I think that's a critical issue that we need to face head on. So thanks for inviting me. It's going to be a great day, great conversation, great panels. I hope I didn't preempt anybody with my own personal views on things, but it's wonderful to see all of you here on a Monday morning caring about our kids. Thank you very much.
As a matter of fact, that is one of the subjects we're considering for a fall conference, is the state of teaching. Thank you to Dr. Evers. Thank you to Dr. Lovell for both of you being part of this. There already has been reference here to the Marquette Law School poll. We are not, we don't want to be overly aggressive, but we're not shy about saying that the poll has been the most thorough and the most reliable indicator of public sentiment in Wisconsin since the start of 2012. And I'm pleased to turn the podium over to Dr. Charles Franklin, the head of the poll, and Mike Goucher, my colleague and distinguished fellow here, to talk about recent rounds of poll results related to education questions.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everyone. Good to have you with us here at the law school today. I'm Mike Goucher. Joining me, as he always does when we talk about polling results, is Professor Franklin, who's been the director of the law school poll since we began polling back in 2012. Very briefly, what we want to do today is describe some results of polling that we've done on education issues. As many of you in this audience know, we look at a lot of different public policy issues. We look at various races for elected office, but today we're going to be looking at education specifically, and largely at results from a poll that was done back in April and released in the middle of April. So, Charles, let's get right to it. And I guess we could say, let's begin with general satisfaction. How do people feel about public schools, K through 12 education in this state?
Right. So this is the question that we've asked several times. Here's the trend. You can see we asked it 3 times back in 2012, once or twice in 13, and now today. And the point here is the green line is people who say they are either very satisfied or satisfied with the public schools in their community, specifically their community. And you can see that that bumps up around in the mid to upper 70s in most cases. There's one a little higher than that, but overall, strong satisfaction.
Let's take a look at region.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're going to organize this, or at least my presentation organizes most of what you're going to see along 2 dimensions. The first is region, because regions is where we live, regions are where legislators come from, regions also define a variety of the kinds of issues facing public education, all education in the state. And so what you see here is what we've seen many times before, and I'm going to focus only on the April data This is April 10th was when we finished this survey. That satisfaction, satisfied with the schools is higher than dissatisfied by a large margin everywhere in the state except the city of Milwaukee, where it's about an even balance. We've seen those in previous surveys tip sometimes a few points more positive, sometimes a few points more negative, but without any dramatic shifts over time.
How about party ID, Charles?
And partisanship. For anybody that's listened to our political polling, this is a breathtaking slide because there are no partisan differences in satisfaction with your community's schools. This won't be the case of every slide I show you today, but when it comes to satisfaction with your community's public schools, it's really high, and there's just virtually no difference between partisans in how they feel about the job the public schools are doing.
In the April poll, we asked a question about the governor's initial budget proposal, which would have cut $127 million from K through 12 public education in the first year of the budget. How did people feel about that, Charles?
Not real supportive. 78% opposed that cut, 18% support it. Now, you've heard almost universally on all sides, including the governor himself, that we'd like to avoid doing this. So this is one where public opinion is quite overwhelming, and the political response seems to have been uniformly, we don't want to do this.
Any difference by region?
No. Not to be too glib about it, but it's striking to me, in fact, how strong the regional pattern remains. Milwaukee City, remember in that last slide, was the only place where we saw substantial levels of dissatisfaction. So it's not surprising that the rest of the state, which is quite satisfied, is also very much opposed to the cuts. But that opposition to the cuts is at least as high in the city of Milwaukee as well.
Let's take a look at party ID again, Charles.
Here we do see a bit of a difference, though in every group, including the two Republican groups, which are puzzlingly over there on the left instead of over on the right. I guess I better fix that. But they are the right groups. You see that opposition is still higher than support for those cuts, though it's substantially less. And you would expect that with leadership from your party's leader who proposed these cuts in the first place. And here we're beginning to see where political differences start to exert themselves on policy questions, even though we did not see political differences in the satisfaction with the schools. And so if you're keeping track of the regional and the partisan differences, that transition is now being made as we see policy debates taking on a partisan overtone.
Charles, Superintendent Evers touched on this. He said, we asked a question, and the question was essentially, which is more important, reducing property taxes or increasing spending on K through 12 education? Right. Let's take a look at that.
Yep, because this is the classic trade-off. And in this latest poll, there's a small majority that would rather increase K-12 spending rather than cut property taxes. Now, we've not always seen that.
So, yeah.
Nope, not always been so. In 2013, when we were debating what to do with a windfall in state revenues, there wasn't an overwhelming balance for property taxes, but it was clear in two separate polls that a plurality favored the property tax relief over the spending for schools. In other polling we did around that time, people continue to see the property tax as the most onerous tax, the one that they would most like to see cut. So this bit of a reversal on this in the April data suggests perhaps after several years of property tax relief and discussion of it, or perhaps perceptions of their community's school's financial situation, the balance has tipped a little bit. I would not by any means go so far as to say this is a permanent shift in opinion, nor is it an overwhelming preference for K-12 over property taxes. So, stay tuned to see how that develops in the long run. But there does seem to have been a little bit of a shift there.
We do see some regional differences here, too.
We do. And you see, especially in the WOW counties, the Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington counties, and then southeastern Wisconsin is everything else, including the county of Milwaukee that's not part of the city of Milwaukee, and the broader TV media market, which goes out another ring or two of counties. In those areas, which are predominantly suburban, there's more support for property tax cuts rather than K-12 spending. But in the rest of the state, with the exception of that Minneapolis, Duluth, Superior, and Wausau area on the far right, where it's about balanced, in most of the rest of the state, including, importantly, the Green Bay and Appleton areas, there's more support for K-12 spending over property tax relief. So there's some differences here, more so than what we've seen in the other policies, and perhaps when you think about housing patterns, property values, political values, you can think that, okay, that probably makes pretty good sense.
Big differences, too, Charles, in how people view themselves politically.
Yes. And here we see political perceptions and preferences make a huge difference, with Republicans much more concerned about property taxes, Democrats overwhelmingly concerned about K-12, but an interesting swing group with those independents in the middle who are, on balance, just a little bit more likely to prefer K-12 rather than property tax cuts. Again, political leadership on an issue structures people's views when there's a direct connection between the policy and the positions the parties are taking.
Any significant difference among people who have kids in their home and people who do not have kids?
Mike made me take these out because I was going to show them to you on every single slide. I know you wanted to know it. You know you did. But the striking thing is, for most of these, having kids in the home or whether you own rather than rent makes almost no difference on these things. So everywhere I've not shown you is implicitly a case where there's just really no difference. Here on this one, you can see a little bit of a difference. People with kids have, on balance, more preference for K-12. People without kids still prefer K-12 by a small amount, but a smaller one. Owning the home does also what you would expect. It makes you more sensitive to property taxes, but again, by a smidgen at least. Still, in this poll, a preference for K-12. That was not the case. It was the reverse of that when we polled about it in 2013.
Charles, let's have you walk through some of our voucher results. We've asked a number of different voucher questions in past polls, and why don't you just kind of walk us through what we found?
Sure. So the current proposal is that we expand vouchers statewide without a limit, with a great deal of complexity about how that would be funded. We didn't ask about how it would be funded. So do you support this lifting the limit on vouchers statewide? So what is that, 37% support, 50, I can't read it from here, 50-something percent.
54. Mm-hmm.
I do have an appointment with the ophthalmologist in July. Oppose. Now, let's look at that with a different question that we asked last fall, where we laid out the options. No limit at all on vouchers, increase from the current 1,000 limit, but not without any limit, keep the current 1,000 limit, or do away with the statewide vouchers altogether. Not the Milwaukee Racine, but the statewide. Okay? So if you combine the two bars on the left, that would be some kind of expansion, and you combine the one that says no change from the current 1,000 and the end at all, turns out those percentages are within 2 or 3 points of what we got this time. So two different questions, two different ways of getting at it, very similar results. However, in October last year, we asked a somewhat different question about whether you should simply expand vouchers statewide, and we didn't talk about current limits or future limits or anything like that. So Would you like to see vouchers extended statewide? And here, a very small plurality favoring expansion. St. Norbert, in their polling for public radio, also found somewhat different results on this. So I raise it to let you know the variety of opinion that we see, and also that how you phrase the question may make some differences. The division between the two sides is fairly modest anyway, so a little bit of question wording variation tips it up or down for which side has the plurality.
Let's go back to the April question that we asked and look at it by region.
Right. Not a lot of regional variation, but here you see in the WOW counties in southeastern Wisconsin the case where support for expansion is the greatest. The rest of the state, opposition to that unlimited expansion is higher.
Party ID?
I cannot explain the Republicans over there on the left. Seriously, you would expect the most dedicated Republicans to favor expansion. That's essentially the party's position. There's nothing that group has said in the previous slides that would lead you to expect the result here that they're similar. So I'm going to leave that as simply a mystery. It doesn't look like the group is skewed or different in any way when we look at all the other things. So I'll just leave that by itself. But you otherwise see substantial party differences. And we pointed out independents earlier, an important swing group and one where concern or opposition to expansion is noticeably high.
One of the panels today will talk about testing, and we did ask several questions about testing today. Charles, let's begin with the whether or not we should end state funding for Common Core-based tests.
Right. So this is a proposal the governor made in his budget. More opposition than support, not overwhelmingly, but more opposition. If we look at that by region, you again see the WOW counties stand out as the exception compared to the picture elsewhere, with about an even balance in that western and northern part of the state of Minneapolis and over to Wausau and up north. But aside from that, every other region shows a significant plurality who are on the opposed side to ending state funding for Common Core-based tests.
Party ID.
By party. Now you see those partisan differences are back, and so again, that's why I'm at a loss to explain the previous Republican result. But about an even balance among Republicans and independents who lean to Republican ideas, more opposition consistently for independents and across two styles of Democrats.
How do people feel about continuing tests, yearly tests in English and math?
So if you think of these two elements, one is the commingling of the Common Core issue with the testing issue. The other side of it is, are we testing too much? Do we just not believe in testing without any mention of Common Core? And maybe to my surprise, an overwhelming 80% support annual tests in math and English. Now, that's a sort of constrained set of topics, but it is annual testing and very strong support for that. Regionally, the support everywhere is as strong, including the WOW and southeastern counties as well. So this is not an opposition to testing in principle. Partisan differences are also quite minor on this issue. So a lot of support for some kind of continued tests.
Another issue we'll be talking about here today is what to do about low-performing schools. And we asked a question that sort of says, do you need a separate state agency to come in and do this, or do you leave it up to the choices of parents to make improvements in a district?
And here, leave it to the parents is a popular option. We'll also see regionally, that's the popular option everywhere except the city of Milwaukee, where there's a striking exception there. And if we look at it in partisan terms, it is a bit politicized with much more support for leaving it to parents on the Republican side, about an even balance on the Democratic side.
And children in the home or no children
And this is interesting because you might think children in the home would make a big difference here. It makes a modest difference, but not a big difference.
Again, we'll wrap things up, and all we'll say is that we hope that this presentation and the findings that Charles just went through with us helps lay a foundation for some of the discussions that will follow today. Having said that, I'll turn it back over to Alan, who's lurking over there to my left. All right, Alan.
One of the things we wanted to do today is to provide some context for what's going on in Wisconsin, especially related to money and funding. And so Dean Kearney had said, well, there must be a good person to get to do that. And I said, you're right. I need to go out searching. And I searched, and the answer, which I think is a really good answer, is Michael Griffith from the Education Commission of the States. ECS is a nonpartisan agency that serves, based in Denver, that serves all 50 states, am I right?
49.
49 states? Okay, who's the one?
The holdout is Washington State.
Oh, well.
So, and 3 territories and D.C. we also have.
That serves simply by collecting and providing information on what's going on in lots of different issues. Money is one of them. Mike is a fiscal analyst, senior fiscal analyst, I believe is the title for ECS, and has an extensive background in this. And I might add, has been, I know, traveling around the country quite a bit, speaking on these kind of themes. And my question is simply, put Wisconsin in the context of the nation when it comes particularly to spending on schools.
I have this really nice PowerPoint I could show you that takes about a half an hour to say exactly what you all know. We went through a recession, and the recession was really bad. And the recession hit every state budget with the exception of North Dakota and Nebraska. And in all those other states, the other 48 states, we saw some form of education cuts. It's not surprising. Ed spending is the second highest. K-12 spending is the second highest budget item in almost every state. Medicaid is the highest. So during the recession, we saw these cuts. What is interesting is the recession begins in the 08-09 school year, fiscal year. We didn't see cuts then. We didn't see cuts the next year. We saw cuts the following year because the federal money ran out. The Federal Recovery Act dollars boosted everybody's budget. You guys kind of fall right in line with that. You did okay, not great during those first couple of years of the recession. The Fed dollars drop off, your spending drops just like everybody else's. Where you guys differ is what's happening right now. We're seeing in about 44, 43 states increases in ed spending. We've seen it for the past 2 years. Last year we saw nationally about 4.5%, probably going to see about 4 to 4.5% this coming school year. You have dropped off. And you're in a group, Kansas, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, and Alaska are all in this group that cuts. Louisiana and Alaska, oil money is dried up. It's pretty easy to understand. Pennsylvania and you and Illinois, it happens to deal with policy decisions that were made during the recession that lowered your revenue growth. And that's coming into play now. So while everybody else is growing, and I don't want to overstate it, you know, we're not seeing states getting 10 to 12% increases. We're seeing states with sort of inflationary increases where you don't have that. If you look at the NEA's projections of spending right now for this current school year, for the first time that I could pick up in records, you guys will be below the national average. Prior to the recession, up into the middle of the recession, you were about 10% above the national average on spending per pupil. So you've definitely taken sort of a turn down compared to where the rest of the states were going. And really, again, it's that you have flatlined where they've grown, and that's where the separation comes in. So that's all dreary and horrible news. Maybe we can talk about something better or more exciting.
So how was the weather in Denver?
6 inches of snow yesterday. So,
oh, okay.
But it's melted and it's good now. Just like that. That's a good analogy. Then the recession will end and things will turn well here.
What kind of picture is there nationwide in how money's being raised for schools, federal, state, local balance?
So the Fed dollars went up during the recession to about 14% of spending. Normally, prior to the recession, they were around 9%. Prior to No Child Left Behind being instituted, they were about 7%, and you can look back for about 30 years, they were about 7%. So we saw an increase for No Child Left Behind, then an increase because of the Recovery Act. It's gone back down now, and it's going to be about 9% in this coming school year. we've seen state spending decrease as a percentage and local spending increase. That happens during every recession. The reason being state funds are reliant on sales and income taxes, which are more impacted by downturns in the economy. Local funding comes almost exclusively from property taxes, which even though they didn't grow at the rate that they have in the past, they didn't shrink nationally. So it's one of those we've seen state drop, we're going to see Fed drop, but the projections are that state's going to go back up again now that the recession's over.
And politically, how's this playing in different states? Because I don't remember the number, but the majority of states have Republican governors now, and yet spending seems to be going up.
It is all over the board. It depends on the state you're in, your current situation, how you weathered the recession before. We did find, before the recession, during the recession, there are an awful lot of governors from both parties that declared themselves the education governor. And so we see some states where you might think that there would be reductions in spending that have a majority Republican. Nebraska, for instance, all through the recession, they continued to increase their spending on K-12 education. And they're looking again at sort of revising their school system and putting even more money into the system. Nebraska is the only state with a unicameral legislature. They do not have party affiliations, but the tallies come pretty close to about 80% Republican. The governors have been Republican through this whole recession, so you can't really tag it to one party or the other. There are movements in certain states for reducing spending. Kansas, for instance, has money available that they could put towards education, but the governor and the legislature have chosen to freeze education spending there and put it on hold for 2 years while they work out a new funding system. So they're going to go a 2-year period now without any additional spending. Where you see some other states that, California, for instance, that had a voter initiative that put a tremendous amount more. I want to say $9 billion in the first year. You have to put that in perspective. About 20% of all the kids in public education are in schools in California. So it's huge. $9 billion to them is still a lot of money, but it's much different than $9 billion for your state would be.
Is there any sense of what the sentiment is and whether you get your money's worth when you put more money into education? Because frankly, I just read a report recently, a locally generated report saying there isn't much correlation between spending and academic results. How's that playing out in different places?
It's difficult. I think the survey that you had here gets mirrored in every state, which is, I like my local school. I think they're doing great. My local school needs more money. I don't like the state schools. The state system is horrible. They need less money. And it's one of these weird things that you get. People do love their public school. They go into it, they see that it isn't extravagant what it is, that they know that their children or their grandchildren or their neighbors' kids don't necessarily have all the resources that they could have, and so they're very generous locally. Statewide, though, the perception is that schools aren't doing the job. And nationally, you see these numbers too. I always think it's interesting. Education is one of the few areas that both the advocates and the opponents of public education talk about how bad public education is. The advocates talk about it and saying we're underfunded, so we're not doing the things we want. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have enough supplies. We aren't getting kids up to the levels we want them to be at. The opponents are saying it's just being done wrong and you need to improve. The public is slowly picking up on this, and when they hear negative about public education, it's coming out in the polls. Again, they like their local schools. They just think the rest are bad. I think that's where you get the voucher numbers. When you have the Republican and wealthy districts are saying, I like vouchers. I don't like them for my district, and we find that very often. My schools are good. I want vouchers for the other kids' schools, and that's a big national trend. Ask the general question about vouchers, people tend to say yes. Ask them about their school district, and they say no. So you're no different in that sense from what the national polling is showing.
I have been interested over the years in Massachusetts, where in the mid-90s, they put a lot more money into schools and tied it to setting higher ambitions for what they'll accomplish, which frankly played out pretty well in Massachusetts. They've led the country in NAEP scores in the last decade, which they weren't in the mid-90s. Is there any tie between money and academic ambitions that you're seeing in other states around the country?
Yes, and the Massachusetts one is interesting because that was accidental. There was a committee in the legislature that was working on school funding and another committee in the legislature that was working on student achievement. And one person was on both committees and said, why aren't we talking? Why aren't we hooking up our funding system to our achievement system? So they actually got together back there in the mid-90s and said, I think it was 94 or something like that, and said, let's connect these two things. Let's come up with a funding system that is tied to what we believe is working currently in education. So if you look at their funding system, it has dollar amounts for things like professional development for teachers, for extra student achievement, for teacher training, all sorts of things. You don't have to spend your dollars on that if you're a school district, but if you're not doing well, if you're not performing well, the state will say, why aren't you spending this amount on professional development? Why aren't you spending this amount on technology? And so they've tried to tie those things together. When they put the extra dollars in, though, they said you're only getting these extra dollars with a higher expectation for your kids. So those two things came together. Their testing in the first couple of years was atrocious. They had their students just fell through the floor. Prior to that, they had 70, 80% of their kids testing proficient. They put that system in and they had something like 30 or 40%. But they stuck with it, and it was tough, but they got the kids up to standards. And what they say now is high expectations and stick with them. And they do lead on almost every NAEP exam. And what's important is not just the overall test, but when you break it down by minority group, they have some of the highest NAEP exams for African American students, for English language learner students, for special ed students across the board. So it's a system that really works. I still find it interesting, though, because most of the time we still have separate committees to talk about school funding and then a separate committee to talk about student achievement. And I would say in any state, you need to link those up and you need to tie those together. And increased spending works as long as it's tied to increased expectations.
Wisconsin, we had 4 years ago the Act 10 decisions, which changed the landscape greatly. In other states, some of which have had similar things, again, put what Wisconsin did in the context of what you've seen in other states when it comes to funding and policy related to teachers.
So there's been a movement to, one way or the other, remove teacher tenure, remove teacher protections, allow greater flexibility, or to base tenure only on achievement. So in my home state, Colorado, there was a piece of legislation that passed that said there is no more tenure, that your job will be reviewed every couple of years, and if you're low performing, you can be removed as a teacher. It was very popular, actually passed on a bipartisan basis. We've seen that trend in states where they're moving that way, where they're talking, the state is taking more and more control over these issues, tenure, teachers, collective bargaining agreements, those were all seen as local issues in the past. Now they're being seen as state issues. And this really mirrors a bigger trend that we've seen over the last 25 years or so. States now pick up a higher percentage of spending for education than locals. And with that additional money has come additional control. And it was never the intention. Usually the intention was moving away from local funding was done in states to reduce property tax levies. So they traded lower property tax for higher sales or income tax. It was done in a lot of states, started in California with Prop 13 in the 80s, has moved across. Once that happened, once states started to pick up bigger tabs, they started to take greater control over school districts. You can argue if this is good or bad, but it's the trend that exists. That control is just continuing to move on things like the changes you had here in your state and the changes we're seeing in others. States are saying if we're picking up the tab, the majority of the tab, we're picking up the majority of the decisions. And we're going to decide on things like collective bargaining, like teacher tenure, student achievement, how often you're going to be tested. Those are going to start being state decisions. So we've seen that move across the state. It's not a one-on-one. I mean, it's been a 30-something year trend, but it's happening more and more.
We're going to take questions from the audience. One question, last question from me, I think. I know you were in Illinois recently. We always enjoy Wisconsin-Illinois comparisons, particularly if they involve professional football. What did you find in Illinois?
So I have to say,
They got a huge pension mess there.
oh my God. So the person who presented before me actually mentioned something about your state, and the legislator cut him off and said, we don't want to hear about Wisconsin. So you guys have a nice little rivalry going here. So what's happening in Illinois is they were going through some tough times to begin with, but they had an increase in the income tax sunset during this school year, which decreased the pot of money available for education significantly. So they're looking at making some substantial cuts this coming school year. On top of that, they have the highest unfunded pension liability per pupil in the country. Most economists will tell you you have to be, or finance experts, you have to have your pension program funded at least 80%, or you start to be in trouble. You get below 65% and you're in real trouble. They're below 50%. They made some changes that would boost that number, but the courts in the state ruled, it was either on Thursday or Friday, that those changes are illegal. That they would have cut pensions, they would have increased the amount of money that teachers needed to pay as a share of the amount, and it would have increased some state funding for it too. They are up against it because the courts said, you have to fully fund this. You can't cut benefits. They don't have enough money to fund their schools right now. So something's got to give. They don't have a solution. They're continuing to go through their legislative session hoping to find something, but barring a tax increase, they are looking at substantial cuts in education there. Illinois also has the greatest inequity between the wealthiest and the poorest districts in the country. They have a couple of districts in the Chicagoland area that fund their schools over $25,000 per kid. In the southern part of the state, there are some school districts that fund their kids at $7,000 per kid. One of the school districts actually funds at $30,000 per kid. They have one counselor for every 25 kids. Putting that in national perspective, on national average, it's 250 kids per counselor. Their average teacher pay in that school district is close to $100,000. So you're talking about a system that has huge inequities in it and is looking at some major cuts. Those cuts will disproportionately hit those lower wealth districts. So the places in the south and in the middle part of the state will be hit hard. So at least you guys aren't in this situation, so you're not Illinois. So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. It's one of these, I was working with them, they're working with a bunch of other people. There isn't an easy solution to what's going on there.
I mean, I listen to that and I say there is something to be said for not just pushing the ball down the road for a while, because that was what they were doing there in many states. Many ways we've done that in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and they made a decision that the tax increase that they put into place, which lasted, I think, 3 years, the intention was that that money would be used to go to the pension funds, to bolster the pension amounts. They instead used that money for operations and used part of it for pensions, but didn't use the whole thing. And that's one of the situations they're in right now. Actually, that worked against them because what the judge said, when the state said to the court, we can't afford to pay our pension liability right now. And the court said, you just had an income tax that you let sunset. If you could have afforded that then, you can afford it now. You need to reinstitute that income tax increase. But there is no political appetite in the state to do that right now. So, yeah, that's.
We have a lot of very knowledgeable people in the audience. Be glad to take questions. If you're in ahead of that railing there, there's this little thing on your desk, and if you move the lower rung there, your microphone will go on, I believe.
Okay, thank you. My question is, how does Wisconsin fit in nationally with funding private schools, and do you go to the level of funding private religious schools in your comparisons?
So you're saying funding for private schools?
Yeah, I mean the voucher program here.
Currently with our voucher program?
So your voucher program is I wouldn't say unique, but there are only a handful of states that have a similar program: Ohio, Indiana, Florida. There might be one or two more, but they tend to be small programs that are available only to a select group of kids. There's talk in several states like Indiana to expand it out, to make it available to every student. But as a percentage of the number of public school students out there, there are something like 47 million public school students. We're talking something like maybe 20,000 kids in the entire country receive vouchers. So as a percentage, it's very small. It gets an awful lot of talk, and there's a lot of movement. There are unique things in other states that actually funnel money to private schools. So in different states, they actually provide busing programs. In Pennsylvania, a school district has to pay for the busing for kids to go to private school. In New Jersey, they pay for textbooks. In some technology, in some states, they allow a student who's a special ed student to attend a private school, and they will cover their full tuition. And these are kids with mild disabilities. In every state, because of the federal law, you have to allow them to attend private schools if the public school can't meet it. But there are certain kids with mild disabilities, and that's usually an East Coast thing. So it's a small percentage, but it's an awful lot of talk, and it's potential for growth nationally. So.
Other questions? And on that voucher front, is there a trend nationally?
Yeah, and again, we see this where there's always talk of expanding vouchers. The public is supportive of it until it's explained to the public what the vouchers are and who they're for, and then they back away. There's the tipping point really is, can vouchers be used in conjunction with private money? So if you wanted to go, if you got a, say, $8,000 voucher, is it mandated that that $8,000 voucher cover the cost of school and the parents pay nothing? Under that type of system, most of the higher level private schools refuse to participate. The dollar amount is too small. It won't fully cover tuition, so either they'll only open a space or two up or they won't participate at all. If you could use that private voucher in conjunction with parents paying a tuition amount, then I think you would see a tipping point in the upper middle class and the wealthy families supporting it wholeheartedly. Because now they could use a voucher, it would lower the cost of private tuition, and it could increase the number of families that would take advantage of it. So we saw in Florida that an awful lot of the upper level private schools didn't open themselves to the voucher program because they said it's insufficient to fully pay for schools. Because in Florida, it has to fully cover the child's tuition.
Let's go back to the federal level. Big sea change, best as I'm aware, in the flow of federal money, that you're not going to have race to the top and some more money coming. What impact is that going to have on state education spending?
So, yeah, there are an awful lot of states that are kind of wishfully thinking that the feds will come through with more dollars, and it's not going to happen. They're pretty much deadlocked. The best you're going to hope for from federal dollars is maybe a 2 or 3% increase, an inflationary increase from one year to the next. Most of the federal dollars get eaten up by IDEA, the special ed funding, or Title I. About 65% of the money coming out of the Department of Ed goes to those two programs. So if there is a bit of an appetite on the feds to increase the special ed funding, that seems to go across parties. But the rest of the programs, there is no appetite. In fact, they're looking at consolidating a lot of those programs down or even eliminating them and taking the money and putting it in either special ed or Title I. So it's going to depend on who you are as a school district, where you get your money. Do you get it from those two programs or do you get it from some of the other programs? Impact aid, for instance, is actually one of these things. Nationally, it's very small, but for individual schools, it's very important. And that looks like it's being flat funded for the near future because, again, it's not spread across the country and doesn't have sort of universal support.
Impact aid meaning?
Impact aid are the dollars that the feds give to replace essentially the property tax value lost by federal facilities. So it's federal forest land, areas outside military bases, some other federal lands that they pay you, I think it's $1 an acre in lieu of property taxes. These checks can be pretty big to rural school districts if you have some national forest land or if you have some other federal property there. And so my guess is you have 2 or 3 school districts in this state that really rely on impact aid, that count that as a nice check that they get. The vast majority receive nothing or receive such a small amount that it's insignificant. So especially once you start getting out to the western states, it becomes very important because of the percentage of federal land increases.
Other questions? In the back there.
Yeah, you mentioned Medicaid in schools in most states. Kind of how far behind is corrections in Wisconsin and the rest of the country? Do you know that?
So I don't. I can tell you that when we went through the recession, people in education are upset about the money they lost. But really, it was held harmless for the most part. There were decreases overall, but states did everything they could to protect K-12 education. That meant they had to cut almost everything else. And so things like corrections started to take a cut for the first time that we've seen since the 80s. You also saw, the real loser during the recession has been higher ed. Higher ed has been decimated in many different states. My home state might zero out higher ed within the next 5 years. It's really changed. Some of that are people's attitude, that that's a privilege for middle-class people to attend college, so it's not as necessary as it used to be. Some of it simply is the dollars aren't there. Now, some states are trying to put that money back, but it's an issue. But I would say corrections did see a slight downtick. I don't know about your own state, I'll be honest. I haven't looked at your overall budget. I've just looked at your ed budget. So
let's go back to the big picture. What do you see as trends ahead on state education spending? We're right at the crucial point of the state budget process for the next 2 years here in Wisconsin. Up, down, sideways?
So for you, sideways? I think everybody else pretty much, except for if you're not reliant on oil revenue, or if you're not Pennsylvania, Illinois, or Kansas, then you're looking at up years for the next couple of years. It's always hard to project these things out more than 2 years, but we're definitely on an upswing. Things are looking good for education. We're starting to see where the majority of states now are above what they were funding education at before the recession, even when adjusted for inflation. We'll probably get everybody, again, with the exception of 5 or 6 states, up to that level by the end of a year from now. What states are starting to look at is, we've got additional dollars, what are we going to do with those? They feel they filled the holes in most states. Now they're looking at using these additional dollars for additional programs. There is very little appetite in most states just to put new money into the traditional funding system. Legislatures want the money to go into something that will show student achievement. So one of the big trends we're seeing is early learning. Big bang for your buck. If you don't have universal pre-K, which the vast majority of states don't, that's where we see the money going. In fact, universal pre-K, funding for pre-K in general, went up even during the recession. So we saw K-12 budgets being cut in states, but they were putting more money into pre-K. So I see that as being a hot topic. It's probably going to be for you guys just as it is across the other states. The other is programs that are targeted for at-risk kids to get them up to speed, and programs for ELL kids. Those are the growth areas we've seen. Those two groups of kids, funding going to help them will help raise your overall test scores, and that's what states have picked up on. ELL test scores in particular are, no other term for it, abysmal in most states. You're talking about kids who are in high school in ELL on average at about 6% proficient on the NAEP in most states, and in some states it's below 1%. So states have figured this out, figured that they need to put more resources, more thought into their ELL programs. And it's a change in demographics, quite frankly. If we did not have students coming into this country from other countries, we would have seen a decline in the overall student population starting in 2008. That's the growth in our population is coming from these groups. Even with a tight immigration policy going on now, we're still seeing growth in these areas. So this is one of those things that school districts and states are trying to adapt to and learn. How do we best educate these kids? What are the services that they need? How do we get them up to speed? Because, not only are they doing it for the kids individually, but raising that group up will raise your entire state test scores up. and it's sort of a low-hanging fruit.
Through snow, through rain, through fog, we greatly appreciate your coming from Denver and joining us here and providing exactly what we wanted, a national perspective. So thank you, Michael. And there was actually a starting point for this event, and the starting point lies with Chris Thiel, and I want to thank him that he sent me an email, I think it was, or a conversation, I don't remember, maybe 3 months ago, saying you ought to do something this spring on with, these kind of questions. And I said, that's an excellent idea. Chris is I believe the title is Intergovernmental Relations Specialist for Milwaukee Public Schools, and I thank him for that. 3 or 4 years ago, Chris had another good idea for me. You guys are welcome to sit up there. Why don't you?
Yeah, I'd rather stand.
You'd rather stand? Okay, that's fine. Chris had another good idea for me. He said, you ought to go see Bob Borch. Bob Borch was a business manager in Elmbrook and is a veteran of school finance issues. He had left Elmbrook, he retired from there, and was working for PMA Financial, which is a consulting firm that works with many school districts in the state. Chris said, Bob has this model he calls the fairly normal school district, and it just is, if you strip everything down to the most generic level for a Wisconsin school district, how are things looking financially? So we went over to their office in downtown Milwaukee, and frankly, it was very illuminating. Bob has retired from PMA, second retirement, and his colleague Scott Gralla from PMA is joining him here today to give us a brief look at, go from the macro level of the nation down to the micro level of how things are shaping up in fairly normal.
Thank you, Hal. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Borsch, Scott Gralla. We are going to present in a little bit different fashion than what Alan is used to seeing, the fairly normal school district. Okay. Fairly normal school district actually began, for those of you who are school business management graduates, at University of Whitewater, University of Wisconsin, Whitewater, I'll say it right. And it was a project for the students in doing a model school district, and they would have to do a budget report and everything. Well, Scott got involved at University of Whitewater because he bought the FPP model, which we used in districts throughout the state, to that school and allowed the students to use the model to see what they were doing. And so today, we'd like to use the same model, only we're going to take it a little bit different twist in the fact that Scott will show you what fairly normal school district looks like, but I will take it down to the per student level, and then we'll do some what-ifs. So Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Unlike Bob, I am not retired, but I feel fortunate to have worked with Bob the last 10 years, 5 as a consultant-client relationship, and 5, the last 5 is a colleague. So what we're going to take a look at here, get disclosure out of the way, is we're going to look at a revenue, expenditure, and a projection summary for the fairly normal school district. And this fairly normal district is a district of about 5,000 students, flat enrollment. It's about in the center of the state. But what we're looking at here over the first 5 years does reflect the governor's budget proposal and flat revenues going forward. So as we move forward out of 14-15, our current budget year, in 16, we do see about a % decrease. Our per pupil revenue limit remains flat throughout the 5 years, but what we see here happening in year 1 is the elimination of per pupil categorical aid. It amounts to most districts about a % decrease in revenue. In year 2, when it comes back at the proposed $165, we see about a 1.7% uptick of revenues, and then the following year another decrease because we don't know if that's going to stay around. So as we move forward and look at our expenditure assumptions, this is, again, a fairly normal school district. We're looking at CPI for salaries, 1.62% next year, about a 1.5% in future years, 7% in health insurance. Those are the big 2 expenditures that most districts have to deal with, and a 1% in other. So we can see that's fairly consistent growth throughout this district. And in this district of about 5,000 students, it's about $1.1 million growth in expenditures per year. When we put the two together, we start out by looking at the current year budget. They do have a balanced budget in this district, a fairly healthy fund balance, 19.8%. And we see troubles right away. We see this roller coaster of revenues combined with an annual increase of about 2% in expenditures per year. And in 4 years, this district would be insolvent. So this does represent typically a fairly normal school district. I pulled one out of our files that I thought represented an average school district. We had to change very, very little. So this is really what this district is looking at over the next 5 years. So Bob's going to walk you through what this means on an individual per student basis.
As I thought about our presentation, I thought that it would make it easier for you to understand if we talk about the cost per student and revenue per student on a per student basis. And thus we use the dollar amounts per student that we see here at Fairly Normal School District. This is the first of 6 graphs, I think. This is representing over here on the left is the current year, a balanced budget for Fairly Normal School District. But then as we go forward, we see that the per pupil revenue limit, or per pupil categorical aid, disappears. And so we see a deficit of some $350. Then in the corresponding years, we see the revenue limit, the per pupil comes back, and there's a little relief, but things get worse. Now, this is thinking or showing you what would occur when there isn't any dollars available. We know that's not going to be the case, but I felt that you should see that as a starting point. This is, as the label at the top says, is saying that, let's pretend, down here in the bottom, that the $165 of per pupil categorical aid continues. Do they get any relief? They get some. But you still see the dollars shortage that Scott mentioned with the real district, real Fairly Normal district, that occurs. In the third slide, we now have the dollars in this next year. And of course, what we're all hoping for and what we've been told is that there's a very good possibility that may be restored. But still, we see again the fact that there is little relief in the deficit that the district incurs every year. Now, one thing I should mention is that you have to understand that per pupil categorical aid does not build on itself, but rather it's just a payment for 1 year. And then, well, the governor showed it. It was, although the legislators said last budget that it was going to be $150 thereafter, every year thereafter. We lost that. We lost that. And so if we have the $150 and the $165 added on, the fact is that it's added 1 year, it's taken away the next year. It's added 1 year. So really, it's a zero-sum game is what we're looking at here. Now, going to the restoring the per pupil revenue limit of $75, that the revenue limit builds on a base. And every year that goes up. So you can see that there is quite a bit of relief, though still a troublesome way of happening. And then we look at the increased revenue limit by CPI. We talked about that. It used to be the case. And yet, if we see that with the growth in the per pupil revenue limit, again, if you use the revenue limit, it compounds itself. If you use the per pupil categorical aid, it stays flat. Now, I said, what if we had everything that we wanted? In other words, we have kept our expenditures where they are, and yet we got all the money we needed from both the state and property taxes how much would we need? And as you could see, the per pupil categorical aid stays flat, which we assume it might, but the per pupil revenue limit would have to go up every year, and of course that would mean an increase in revenue from the state, as well as an increase in revenue from property taxes. I think that gives you a good overview of the two areas of revenue that we are most concerned with at this time. Sure, I could talk about a lot of other things, and when we do fairly normal for a school district, we cover all the different gamuts. Also, you could say, well, you could always cut costs. I would make one comment to that, and that is we're already so far into revenue caps. We've had the damage done to our public schools, and we can't keep the cuts going.
As if by magic, some more chairs are supposed to appear. And here they come. So we did some macro, we did some micro, and now let's talk about it. And I'm going to introduce people as we're also shifting the set here. Yes, join us. We have a really strong cast of people to give some thoughts on where are we in terms of fueling schools around here. I'm appreciative to all of them. Let me introduce them, and you're welcome to come up here as we do this. Representative Dale Kianga, who is the Vice Chair of the Joint Finance Committee, who is a CPA in his own background, and has become frankly, the order isn't too important here, and who has become, has an MBA as well, and who's become a forceful figure in education thinking in the legislature. He is a Republican from Brookfield. I might add, for those of you checking your electronic media, as the superintendent said earlier, he's in the news this morning, which may even come up here. And so, welcome. With him, Jeff Pirtle. Jeff's here, right? Yes. Jeff Pirtle is the Senior Policy Advisor to Superintendent Evers, and has been with the DPI since 2009 in that role. Happens to also be a member of the Dane County Board, I know, and has a strong background in education thinking. Mark Duff is here, over there, yes. Mark Duff is the finance chief of Racine Schools and was a Republican member of the State Assembly around 1990, that era, when Tommy Thompson was the governor of Wisconsin. Emily Kazilla is the business manager of Brown Deer, was a member of the Shorewood School Board and a leader in Shorewood Schools for about 15 years. And I don't want you to think less of her, but she has a law degree from Duke. And, I wasn't supposed to say that? Oh, okay. Don't pay attention to the fact that she has a law degree from Duke. And Todd Berry, who is, since 1994, the president of the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, also known as WISTAX, and I think has a well-established reputation as someone who believes in facts and reliable numbers and really paying attention to the realities of school finance. And, okay. And I'm eager to start with sort of a general question as to, should I take the last seat up there? I suppose so. How are we doing on fueling the school system in Wisconsin? Do we have enough gas in the tank, and what lies ahead? Let's start with Representative Kianga.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this forum. We greatly appreciate it, and I think what our state needs is continued dialogue on education across the spectrum, so thank you. As far as where we're at now, we're definitely above the national average, which is good. I think as far as where we go from here is a discussion we're going to have. I know that we're committed from the Assembly and Joint Finance right now to, at the very minimal, do no harm. Let's not cut our schools, any type of schools. And so we're working tirelessly. I literally have a army cot in my office and sleep there at night, just find the revenue to make sure that we keep our schools whole. But I think what's really important in education is a lot of, and I've been here the whole time, so I apologize, but all too often I think the discussion on education is centered around funding, and I think a responsible talk about education should not only be about the inputs, but should be about the outputs of education. That's what really matters, is the outputs, not the inputs. And so over the last 4 years, our outputs have increased, especially among the minority graduation rates, closing that gap. And our overall graduation rate of Wisconsin has gone from 86% to 88%. And there's other good output information that says we're on the right trajectory. But with that being said, I think we need to continue to look at what we're putting into education. And I really like the previous speaker who said going forward we should really tie dollars to performance. I think that's what we're trying to figure out in Wisconsin going forward.
Sure. That would be me. Am I still on? Okay. So I agree, and I think one of the things that we've really seen in the last few years is overall, Wisconsin has an incredibly strong education system. The state superintendent talked about that this morning. Nation-leading graduation rates, best in the Midwest on AP, nation-leading ACT scores. But we also have one of the largest achievement gaps in the country. And when we're kind of breaking down where we need to go, I think it's helpful to take a larger view of what's going on in Wisconsin. And especially when we think about the fact that we've been through two major recessions really in the last 10 to 15 years, right after 9/11 and then again in 2008. And if we look back over that last 10 to 15 years, we start out with the average free and reduced price lunch rate in Wisconsin was about 21%. Today it's 43%. So it doubles in that last decade. The other thing we really see going on is at that time we had about a third of the school districts in declining enrollment. Well, today we have about the same number of kids, but 2/3 of the school districts are in declining enrollment. So think about it like a balloon. If I squeeze 2/3 of it, that other third has to get bigger, right? So we see a suburbanization going on. And if we looked at the little Wisconsin map and we looked at the north and western parts of the state and central bands, we see significant declines in economic activity, in median income, free and reduced price lunch rate, and huge exoduses of the number of people who are living there. So when we think about how do we meet these needs, how do we meet them in a suburban area, how do we meet them in a rural area, keep in mind we have 424 school districts, but 50% of the school districts have less than 1,000 kids. 83% have less than 3,000 kids in them. We are mostly a state of small school districts. So when we tackle these problems, there's a lot of complicated issues that come into them. And the courts have told us there's three things you have to keep in mind when it comes to school finance. You got to serve low-income kids, you got to serve students with disabilities, you got to serve English language learners. And I think we're struggling in all three of those areas. We tend to look at the SAGE program for low-income kids. That's going through a lot of review, but hasn't seen significant funding increases. We're seeing smaller and smaller reimbursement rates for students with disabilities. And ELL funding we pay 9 cents on the dollar. So it's a really, really difficult situation when we think about how do we meet the kids who have the greatest level of need, how do we close those achievement gaps, and how do we make that work? And that's hard to divorce that conversation from the larger fiscal questions. There's really three things we have to think about. What's our global fiscal picture going to look like? That means transportation, that means Medicaid, that means tax cuts, that means education, all those things together. 39% of the general fund is spent on education. You can't divorce that from all these other conversations. How are you going to fund schools? What's your school finance system look like, and is it meeting the needs of all districts and kids? And one of the things we've really seen is a shift to ballot box budgeting. The superintendent mentioned it. 60-70% of school districts that are going to our friend are succeeding. That is very different than the world we lived in for the last 20 years, where 52% were passing. We see it in the polls. We see it in folks stepping up. They think this is the most important investment. So I think the challenge, and the Finance Committee is going to have to tackle this, is they've made this commitment to kind of get back to zero. My friend Christie would call regular broken. And so I think the question is, how do we move past that, and where does that position us in the future? So looking forward to the conversation.
Mark Duff.
Yep, thank you. As was mentioned, I served in the legislature for 14 years during when the revenue caps and things were imposed, and now I'm a school finance official. And so I was saying paying for the sins of when I was in the legislature. And but it is an amazing challenge to be working in public education and being a public servant. And this question was how to fuel schools adequately was something that we could spend months discussing this, and because everybody would have a different opinion, I think, in this room, and but it's rarely asked. When we set up the revenue limits and the school finance structure, nothing was talked about funding schools adequately. Now it's just incremental percent changes. Nobody was really asking, is this what we need to support funding schools adequately? So unfortunately, the budget system, which is now my job, just what the legislature is doing now is saying, well, this is about what we can afford and this is what we're going to do as a flat percent. Now I have to do as a school budget director saying to my school, sorry, this is all we get for funding. We can't do this behavioral program change. We'll struggle to do change our curriculum to restructure and deal with achievement gaps. We want to transform our high school into career academies, and there's all these things. And now we have the pressures of being able to afford substitutes, having a shortage of substitutes. We have to increase pay to recruit that. Now we have the free market of recruiting high-level educational staff. It used to be a little more easy with the structured union system. Now we have a completely free market system for getting staff, and now we have to pay differently. It's an exciting time right now, and it is both. But I'm in for it. This is a great opportunity. But the challenge also that, I was going to say that not only fuel schools, you didn't say public schools, because I think the legislature in their system asked that we have now a multi-tiered public school system. We have traditional public education, we have public-private education through vouchers, and the charter education, and now they have to figure all that stuff out as to what's the adequate level so that we can have students achieve, deal with the achievement gap, and help our kids have a great life. So that's my beginning comment. Thank you.
In this distinguished group, it appears to me that the most useful role that I can play for you is to share granular data on school costs at the district level, partly going back for 5 years and partly going forward. I will also posit that the question of how much money schools need is not a standalone question. In 2010-11, our biggest state drop in school funding came hand in hand with new authority to spend intelligently, and that was a good bargain. Our spending is lower than 5 years ago. I have a chart to show you my top 12 costs and what they're doing today versus 5 years ago, if you want to see it afterwards. But the long and the short of the chart is that our spending is much smarter and more focused spending than it was 5 years ago, and that the drop has not come at the children's expense. And isn't that nice that my colleague to my right is nodding? And I know I have several other colleagues in the room to say the same. To give you that data then, I serve a charming village in a historic suburb just over the north border of Milwaukee. Our village is not wealthy, and it has the second highest minority enrollment in Wisconsin, right behind Milwaukee Public Schools. We spend, for an average child in general education, $10,737.50. My district, for that money, gets nice class sizes, specialists for art, band, orchestra, vocal music, and library. We have a good selection of extracurricular and athletic activities. We have computer technology in every room, as well as technology labs and mobile carts of iPads and Chromebooks. We have 5 reading specialists. We have Tier 2 and 3 intervention for students in difficulty. We have a full-time staff member for our gifted learners and a respected set of programs for the 17.4% of our students who struggle with physical, emotional, or behavioral disabilities. We have a federally funded after-school program for our struggling learners, which is regarded as exemplary. We have 9 full days of professional development annually for all staff. We have implemented PBIS, RTI, and educator effectiveness, and all of our instructional administrators are Teachscape calibrated. It was right about this point in the speech that I thought I ought to put, and we have a pear tree with a partridge in it. We do all this on 2 recently renovated buildings on a beautiful 64-acre campus with multiple botanical habitats for the children's science classes. We have a swimming pool, multiple playing fields, and a stunning athletic field house. So, $10,737.50 per student for general education instruction. But, and you knew there was a but, our 278 special education students have an average additional cost of $12,608 per student, so that their total average actual annual cost is $23,345.50. A further $1,130 per student comes in debt service, which covers our annual bond payments for our buildings, theater, labs, boilers, parking lots, roofs, and grounds. Cost per student comes in many guises because everyone has a different idea of what should be included. But for the 1,567 little children who sit in classrooms in my village, that is what it costs. Our costs are down from 5 years ago when we got that mandatory 5.5% drop in revenue that is graven on all of our hearts. But since that time, with our unprecedented authority to spend, we have been able to do the following. If you noticed in Bob's projection forward, he projected medical trend forward at 7%, and how right he is, that's typical. But medical trend for my district and many of my colleagues in the past 5 years has been 0 or negative, and that was because we could finally negotiate health insurance with our health insurance providers in a way that had some meaning. My health insurance in my district is down from 5 years ago in actual dollars, not percentages, nothing weird, actual dollars. Down from 5 years ago because I no longer need to use the teachers union's health insurance overpriced coverage. Life insurance is also down 60% with no change in coverage whatsoever, not a comma, not a semicolon different, just down 60% because I was able to negotiate provider. We no longer outsource certain types of staffing for the specific purpose of being able to let the teachers go if we need to, because now we have the authority to let a teacher go when they're underperforming, so we no longer pay that 25% upcharge to outsource that particular type of education. This has saved hundreds of thousands of dollars, and none of this has affected the children at all. To be clear, it's not just falling revenue that can be irrelevant to educational quality. I've seen many an increase in revenue that was also irrelevant to educational quality because it went to benefit increases rather than to program change. To be truthful, I'd just as soon not get another 5.5% drop in revenue, or even the 1.5% drop in revenue that has been pending here in the legislature since February. But my business office colleagues and I lived through a choice between keeping more money accompanied by a lot of restrictions and negotiations on how we spend it, or getting less money that we could spend in the smartest way possible. And we can tell you that we did very well by the children with the second choice. We just put our arm around the children and got the money elsewhere. If we did have a little more money, what would we use it for? There would be a lively debate in my little district, and that would be the same debate across the state. There would be a fierce contender for more technology as we personalize our children's learning. There'd be a lively corner in my district where we have a lot of struggling learners for more intervention and tutoring staff. The very boring business officer people would hold out for prepaying debt because it lowers costs for so many years going forward. That's never a popular option. And if there wasn't much money, there might be a vote for increasing extracurricular activities particularly at the elementary level, because it's turning out that they have a surprising ability to develop that resilience and grit that we're looking for, and yet with that coming as an extracurricular rather than as a class, it's that spoonful of sugar that gets the medicine down. The children learn those abilities to come back, to fight again, without it feeling like a lesson in character education. And if the legislature ever did ask us what we need the very, very most, we would say, bad educational results run with poverty. You send us kids with 2 parents and a job, and we'll do fine on those test scores. So good luck with that.
I'm going to go from the granular to the maybe granite. First, want to make one comment. I put on the side of the aisle here a copy of a publication that we had done last summer, which was an attempt to look at national data and try to answer the question how Wisconsin was doing in terms of funding per child compared to the nation through that recessionary period. The answer was we sort of did things backwards. while other states retrenched through 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11. Wisconsin did not. So actually our spending per pupil actually rose compared to the nation during that period. We took all of that multi-year hit in 1 year in 2011-12. And so we basically came back down to the trend line we would have been on had we run things like other states. And federal data through 12 suggested we were still about where we were, slightly above the national average, not dramatically so. Obviously, there's been a couple of years since then. So that's the handout. I wanted to make one or two sort of big picture comments. The first was, I've listened to the legislature for more than a few years, and the word of the day, week, month, year, decade is jobs. And I think it's important to say that we all need to keep our eyes on a bigger picture, which is the demography of this state, as our research has shown in the last year or two, is in the process of doing a dramatic shift. As was mentioned, declining enrollment in school districts is typical. That's been going on statewide since the late 90s. Well, add 15 or 20 years to kids that went to kindergarten in the 90s, you now find they're coming into the workforce. What I'm trying to say here is that all that declining enrollment and frozen enrollment for many years has come home to roost as a workforce that is not going to grow for the next 30 to 40 years. And the reason I say that is you simply cannot create jobs if a governor and legislature could create jobs, which, by the way, they really can't. They can do harm a lot easier than they can do good. But if we're going to create jobs, we have to have people to put in those jobs, and we're going to be swimming against the demographic tide there. The other point I want to make, the question related to money and to adequacy, I want to throw another word into the equation, and that is predictability. I think the biggest problem that school districts in Wisconsin have faced in the last 10 to 15 years has been, as the state has become more and more involved in school financial decision making, as was predicted with the two-thirds decision back in the mid-90s, is that the state would more and more become involved in local school decision making, would become more intrusive, would micromanage more and more, and the result would probably not be good. And that's basically been true. It's the hardest thing for school districts is not the amount of money they have to work with, it's whether they know what it will be next year, the year after, or the year after that. And the governor and the legislature, this governor, the prior governor, and the last 5, 6 legislatures are collectively at fault because the way the state is running its own finances is totally unpredictable. We surged from an $800 million surplus 2 years ago to a $300 million deficit now. We went from pouring money into the school aid formula before the 06 election to cutting school aids in the 09, 10, 11 budget with the last governor, and that's pretty much been the story. If we would just have predictability in what would happen with the revenue limit and predictability in what would happen with general aid without dialing up and down all the bells and whistles, which is what's going on, it would make folks' lives a lot easier. I think Bob Borch's charts showed it all. What he was showing in a district that was stable and sustainable was simply the way we were doing things before the last 10 years. We're not talking about spending money like crazy. We're just talking about a very stable, predictable kind of system. And with that sort of scolding, I'll leave it there. Needless to say, if the state cannot predict its revenues within 2 to 3%, which is its typical margin of error, although they think they can budget to the last penny, then you've got to have reserves of 2 to 3% of what you spend, or you're going to always have budget crises. And that's basically been the story of the last 10 years. The smallest budget balances of almost any state in the country going into a recession, and then everything blows up. And where are we now with this budget? This budget will look very much, when it's put to bed, like the Doyle budget of 08. And the Doyle budget of 08 was the beginning of another series of instability, lurching, the first school aid cut, the first scaling back of revenue limits. So it just amazes me that financial planners tell people to have 3 or 6 months of salary in the bank in cash, and the state is lucky if it has a couple days. So perhaps we, just stick to some real basic logical stuff and we'd all be better off.
I'm eager to do the rest of this conversation as exactly that, a conversation, and not just going up and down the rows. But let's bounce it back to the CPA on our panel, also known as the Vice Chair of the Joint Finance Committee. Any chance of getting stability or changing the system in a way that a leading official of a state education organization said to me before the governor made his proposal? I said, "What do your members want?" He said, "Stop the merry-go-round."
Yeah, I mean, if you're a family or if you're a business or if you're a school district or whatever, wherever you are in life, what you want is certainty, right? I mean, that's essentially what it comes down to, is people want certainty, your own career, whatever it is. And I think that in Madison, and in Washington, there's a certain responsibility for certainty. And so I'll give you an example. Like you talk about the charts with the categorical aid per student. There may have been a legislator who said that's a one-time thing, but I think most legislators thought like this was an ongoing commitment. And essentially why that was one time is because within the building they play games, and there's some people that really care about a structural deficit. So they'll put an asterisk next to that number and say, this is one-time money, and then someone walks away from the table being like, oh, I drove down the structural deficit. But it's more of just a legal language to get a quote on what the structural deficit is, as opposed to a change in policy. Because we know that once you put down a dollar amount for this year's education, the assumption should be, and it is, that should be the same the next year. With that being said, I think that if you have a symposium like this, you should probably have one back-to-back with it on Medicaid, because that's the problem, right? I mean, I think Todd's done a great job in his e-update or newsletters pointing out that's the challenge. Everything's been cut percentage-wise compared to Medicaid. And so when we're looking at this budget, we have over $1 billion in new revenue in this budget. People are always like drawn back when I say that. Like we have over $1 billion. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a Medicaid problem. And, you talk about declining enrollment, that stems from the same problem that we have with Medicaid. This isn't unique to Wisconsin, although Wisconsin is, worse than average, is that we have an aging demographic that's going to demand more Medicaid services. And so it's tough policy-wise, especially in politics. We have 30-second commercials, or you have a tidbit going, go now, and you got to talk about education. But it's irresponsible to talk about education without talking about our Medicaid problems. So, A, we got demographic problems. We can't fix that. But B, we have inflexibilities from D.C., and I really hope that we have more flexibilities to do things that you could provide just as much service, but you could do it in a more flexible way, it will save money. And I think that we are a high tax state, and we also want to continue to serve education. So that's what we want to do going forward. So that's our focus. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry. I started with a reaction, I'll react to that.
And I understand the Medicaid issue is.
It's huge, and so that's where it is. I mean,
and it's important.
Yeah, but maybe you could throw one out for the crowd. I think that would be a good one. I mean, you want wonkushness, we'll do wonky talk. So charter schools, for example, like independent charter schools, that's a draw off the top of our school aid funding, like right off the top. And so politically that's a problem, because when we have new schools here in Milwaukee that are trying innovation, trying something different, that's taking away money from a rural school district that already has declining enrollment. That's both a political and a policy problem. So what we could do is we could do things like create more certainty by pulling that off of the top of the formula and moving that as a categorical, as a separate funding source. And that encourages innovation, and my rural colleagues who support like charter schools and choice schools, then they're in the position where they can support it, but when they support it and that actually increases the number of students, it's not taking away dollars from their district, doesn't put them in a tight spot. So those are the problems that we're trying to fix over the next 2-3 weeks here, and I'm hoping that as we look at I would say you could tell a legislator's not being truthful with you in the Capitol if they say they 100% everything about Medicaid and 100% the school aid funding formula. Just question them on that, because it's very, very, very complicated. But one of the things that we're looking to do over the next couple of weeks is provide more certainty and less complexity in that formula.
One of the pieces is we kind of look across those issues of stability, and I would agree. I think you heard the state superintendent say at the beginning of the day, stability is the thing schools, whether it's in assessment, whether it's in finance, whatever it is a crucial issue. But there are sort of two components. I mean, one is, we're in the great city of Milwaukee here, and nowhere on earth do students have more educational opportunity than they do here. Whether you go to your neighborhood public school, you open enroll to a suburban district, you're in an instrumentality charter, district-run charter, you're in an independent charter, you're in a virtual charter, you're in a choice school, you pay private tuition to go to a private school. I mean, lots and lots of options, all of them funded differently, all of them with different funding sources, all of them drawn differently, that create a hugely complicated system. I mean, next to the IRS, school finance is the next most complicated thing on earth, right? And that is part of the problem in this conversation, as much as I think in the state budget, I mean, I mentioned Medicaid, that's a huge one, but there are others. Transportation is a major factor, how we're going to deal and wrap these pieces together, how much is from the state fund, and I think the tax policy, how much of the tax cuts stimulate, economic growth, how much of that translates into education cuts. I mean, we don't want tax cuts that lead to education cuts. You want tax cuts that lead to economic prosperity and greater revenues. I think all of these policy decisions is we, and one of the challenges of school choice is we're drawing students who are traditionally privately funded into the tax-based system. Well, there are about 90,000 kids in the state of Wisconsin who are private pay today. As we expand that program out, that's going to create greater draw on the system. Even if you're agnostic on whether that's good or bad, that's going to introduce cost. So we have to figure out how to pay for all of these things concurrently in a way that's reasonable and stable and I think makes sense.
So let's assume, and this is just an assumption, and Emily touched on this, that we end up with zero change in overall school revenue cap and $150 and so on. How's that going to play out? I was at the Wisconsin Association of School District Administrators Convention on Friday. I think in that audience as a whole, people would say, this is not good news. We can't keep moving forward without more fuel in the tank. What's your thoughts on how that's going to play out if we end up with basically at zero from where we started, from where we are now, zero change? Let's start with Todd. Well, actually, anyone wants to.
Go ahead. I was going to mention, I think it's going to be different because every school district has a different situation. I was talking to one smaller school district, a school business finance person. They've implemented every tool. And now there aren't any tools left if you go to a zero for achieving some savings. Now in Racine Unified, we still have some options left to save some funds. We're still working on getting additional healthcare savings. We're reviewing different practices. So we have some flexibility, but that's just to keep status quo. So we still have the challenge of turning around our achievement gap, helping our reading and math scores improve, training our staff, hiring new people. So it is going to be different across all the different districts, but so that's why it is a very difficult question.
And can you do that with what you've got in your hands? If
some districts, yes, it's going to be, they can still manage a freeze, and it depends on if you want to dip into fund balance, which is a dangerous precedent of using your fund balance to in operational and creating or worsening that graph that Bob and they put out for the structural deficit. But some districts will be able to handle a one-term freeze, but at some point we're going to run out of opportunities and efficiencies.
My colleagues, as we toss this back and forth, do find the same thing Marcus said, that each of us has a strategy for getting through this coming year. This is a little bit different. We refinanced debt last year. We have a negative 3% health insurance renewal. So we'll get through 2015-16, but we can't keep on. There's two other pieces of the stability equation that I'll throw in just to make it more interesting and complicated. The upward pressure on teachers' salaries has been a fascinating thing to watch since Act 10. Because Act 10 came in during a recession and everybody was a good soldier about it. Everybody knew there weren't going to be any raises. Nobody was going to get a raise of any significance. And that's fine. We didn't. But we also, back in the day when we used to negotiate them, it was always in the back of your mind that whatever raise you negotiated was going to everybody. And some of the teachers were, Mother Teresa, and others of them should possibly have considered a different occupation. All of the ones who should have considered a different occupation are now gone. Am I right? I'm talking to my colleagues in the room. There's been a significant shift out of education of the people who perhaps had done their best work already and needed to rethink. So,
how did that happen? Because they retired?
Some of them retired, and some of them we just encouraged to reconsider their life's work. So, but we had the authority to do that. And they knew we did, and so they are mostly gone. And what that means is that the cadre of teachers that you're looking at in Wisconsin now are as good as you have ever seen, and they're doing the most focused work you've ever seen. They know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. They know exactly how it's going to be measured. They know that all of us are paying attention, that we're feeding them every resource that we can. It's a fascinating thing to watch, and because of educator effectiveness, they all know individually whether they're doing a good job. So it wasn't, I don't think it was 2 days past Act 10 before the first person turned up in my superintendent's office negotiating for a separate raise. But quite aside from that, the whole group of them now are doing such good work that you really want to give all of them a significant raise. They're doing amazing work. So while the WRC is authorizing 1.62 this year, and that's probably all we can afford, there's more and more of them coming in and saying, I'm hitting every benchmark you're setting me. There is no achievement gap in my classroom, and I think I deserve $5,000 to $10,000 more. And the answer is, you do. And if I can get it for you, I will. And that's the pressure that we're going to be looking at in the next 5 years. That's something kind of fun.
But what you're saying about teachers is different than what Tony Evers was saying before, where he's really concerned about the incoming ranks of teachers for the next bunch of years. Enrollment is down in college programs. The attractiveness of the profession is not very high in the eyes of many. What do other people think here about how we're doing with the financial picture we have now as far as employees and the prospects for the quality of employees?
I think
I'm going to ask. I'm going to give Dale first a shot here.
Well, I think in this whole conversation, a lot of people don't realize one of the things that you can't have it's tough to have a conversation in Madison about all public schools because there's such a different type of public schools out there. Even if it's a suburban school next to a suburban, there's just different systems. So one of the things we really want to have is a school district by school district conversation. And so, you're not confined just by the money coming out of Madison and the money coming out of Washington, D.C. You could go to referendum and you can make a case to your voters saying, you know what, we have this free market system in education. We really want the best and brightest. Here's our rationale, or we want a building. And you know what, the vast majority, the veto-proof majority of those referendums pass. But the conversation we should be having on the right education is best had at the local level, and so it's not like you're boxed in, there's no opportunity here. Have a conversation at the local level, go to referendum, and you could go from there. And I think that's part of the process that the conversation, I think the free market in teachers is what we're looking for. I always say the best teachers, I know sometimes it can, this teacher's making over $100,000 with all packages combined in Milwaukee Public Schools. Well, guess what? If that teacher takes one child and that child goes from being someone who doesn't have a job and then ends up in the incarceration and then ends up on other support, that one teacher making $100,000 a year, if they take one life, they've paid for their salary many times over. So I don't think we need to be shy about paying teachers what they're worth. We just got to make sure that the conversation is made locally, that the conversations with teacher isn't from a collective group of teachers, but from an individual basis, and let's pay the best teachers a good salary and make sure they're effectuating change.
Well, this is an interesting conversation because essentially two things that are going on that are going to drive school costs in the future. One is the coming change in referendum activity at the local level. In fact, the newsletter that I finished over the weekend that will probably be printed in the next day or two looks at that. And the argument I'm making is that the public has consumed all this news about education funding and instability and so forth, and they're reacting at the ballot box. And so you have 70% plus of non-recurring school referenda passing at the same time that you have folks at state government promising that property taxes won't go up. So there, something's going to have to give because the voters are saying a different thing than state leaders are. The staffing thing is also an interesting discussion because we do have a more market-oriented staffing situation now, and that is going to put upward pressures on salaries, and to the degree that the state shares in those to the tune of roughly 60%. That's going to put pressure on the state budget as well. So they wished for a more competitive staffing environment. Now they have one, and now the chickens are going to come to roost because they're going to have to fund it. In the old days, you could pay a math teacher, a science teacher, a computer science teacher what you paid an English teacher. Ain't going to be anymore. I sat on a private college board for 15 years, and I can tell you, when you're in that environment, you are paying a lot more for math and computer science and specialty professions. So that world is coming, and of course it's at the same time. I mean, part of it is perhaps lower school of education enrollments, but it's also just again demography. you have a teaching profession in Wisconsin whose average age was getting up there, and those folks have been leaving and will continue to leave. And as they come in the bottom, it may take more money to lure people in too.
I've been hearing this thought that there's going to be more and more referendum votes fairly often lately, and I'm concerned there's a haves and have-nots problem here. Milwaukee went to a referendum on buildings in 1993. It came nowhere near passing. I think it's accepted in political ranks for here, including in MPS, that you can't have a referendum here. People don't have the money and they won't approve it. Is Milwaukee and maybe some other urban districts, the higher poverty districts, less likely to benefit here or gain from here? Because the places where they're passing referendums, including Madison, are much healthier economies than the city of Milwaukee is.
Right. Maybe I could go into this a little bit because I work in Racine, and they have, it's a kind of a mini Milwaukee. Well, I don't know. I might be in trouble, but Racine has had the highest unemployment rate in the state for quite a while. It's got some significant challenges, and I think the confidence in the performance of the district was waning. And there's no doubt that the academic achievement issues at Racine, things needed to change. And so we also had the introduction of vouchers and all that. So we have some new leadership. We are working on changes. We're gaining confidence in the public, and we did go to referendum, and we were able to pass a $127 million referendum to help fix our schools, buy technology and security for our schools. That wouldn't have happened if we didn't have a turnaround and change in perspectives of the public. Now we have high poverty issues within Racine. And that was one of the things I was going to mention, is that the school finance system does not recognize the differences in need of educating students of different demographic backgrounds. And that was one of the things that I would say is a significant flaw in the system, that there are extra needs that should be considered and as higher cost. We are doing wraparound 4K care. We're doing after-school activities, tutoring, Now we're trying to do behavioral programs. There's so many things we're trying to implement to try and turn things around, and we are starting to see results. But when we have a constant freeze in funding and now eroding funding from the federal government, it does make it more challenging.
So some quick thoughts on how the referenda pieces work. And I think the poverty is a significant factor. One of the things I'm going to touch on, I mean, the state superintendent for the last few years has been talking about fair funding and how to reduce school finance and kind of what are these core issues that need to be dealt with. Well, one of them is that 10% of the school districts, 1 in 10, are effectively out of the school aid formula at this point. They get no general equalization aid. They get the categoricals, they get the federal stuff. But in terms of who's paying for those kids to go to school, it's all on the property taxpayer locally. And so when we think about what are those differences, how is this localized, what does it mean? If I'm a district that's paying 100% of the freight for every one of my kids, now some of them are, we have some districts that are $18,000, $20,000 a kid on the revenue limit, but there aren't very many. 90% of the districts are plus or minus $1,000 of the state average. It's harder to be a low-income district with a high property tax and say, oh, by the way, I need this to go up, and I'm not getting any help from the state in that deal. That gets into these equity issues of, I mean, how do you have a school finance system if 1 in 10 aren't in it anymore? I don't know that that's still a system then. So as we unpack these different pieces, as we think about a rational way to do this, should we be, sort of creaming off the top to fund to our charters? Does it make sense to count kids here or not there? How does open enrollment work? I mean, all of these things create incentives, disincentives, and pieces, but the ballot box, while great in terms of connecting with the community, is not necessarily an equitable way to meet your constitutional obligations to fund a school district. And to the degree that we care about stability at the same time, that's a big issue. I went to grad school in California. I can promise you the way they fund their schools, and they have everything frozen, is predominantly through private donations and referenda that create very, very affluent, very, very nice public schools in areas of great disadvantage. I don't think that's in our best interest economically if our goal is to close the achievement gap and stimulate what are increasingly urbanized centers where a lot of the kids are going to be.
Yeah, and there's some of the referendums, there actually are, I mean, there is state dollars that accompany some of the state referendums that go with that. 2 other points. I think that there's other ways that we could agree that there's been a proliferation of TIFs. And I think sometimes it's at the expense of one community over another. And that directly is taking money away from our schools by having these TIFs that are not chipping in, putting money in the pot. And there's times where that makes sense, but there's also times where these things are being abused. And I think there's like smarter policies we could have to make sure that everyone's more uniformly being taxed and chipping in the pot for the school system. The last point I want to make real quickly on the free market and the teachers. One of the things you can do in the supply-demand curve when you have a wage that's getting to the point where you feel like you can't afford it anymore is provide more teachers, right? And so I think one of the things that we're really looking at too in Madison is saying, can we look at some of the licensing requirement for teachers? If we need a shop teacher and we have someone who was an electrician for 20 years and they just want to give back and they want to be part and be a shop teacher, why would we not find a way to get them in the classroom, right? Because we don't have many people with that experience that would go back to school for a couple of years to get the teaching licenses. And then also, not every state, they may have gone through an education program in another state, but they didn't meet the technical requirements of Wisconsin, but they still may be a great educator. I think we should empower the superintendents and the principals to decide who's good in the classroom, not a state statute that's disconnected from the reality of someone's ability to speak in front of a class, connect with students, and know the material.
Given the importance of the subject, I'd like to go on for another hour, but we're not. What I'd like to do is give each of you 1 minute to kind of wrap up. How are we doing? What do you see ahead for having adequate money, and I use the word adequate with a careful choice, I think, to educate the children of Wisconsin, especially those who need it, who have the most needs? Let's start at this end.
Well, I'll be real quick because I'm not going to say anything new, and that is simply the first thing to do is to have certainty, stability, predictability, and that will come if the state can get its budget act together and behave in a fairly stable, predictable way.
Looking ahead, actually, never one single year since I've come into this profession haven't any 2 years been the same. So I'm just prepared for a high wire trapeze act. My superintendent's in the room. We're going to fight every single minute for the best for our children, but honestly, looking ahead, I just see more of the High Wire Trapeze Act. And so, hope you got a nut under me, but the children will be all right. We'll be sure the children are all right. I'm just not sure if we can quite do all the things that we want to do in terms of salaries, in terms of what a school district should be. I read you my list at the beginning. You know we're running a very proud and very cool district. It's a good place to be a child. I think we can keep that up, but it would help if we, Todd's right, if the money is stable. I can do anything if I know, but if I don't know, right now there's a couple numbers we don't get until October. The open enrollment is $1 million number, and I don't know that number until October. I've hired all my teachers. My children are sitting in the seats, and then I come into the superintendent and go, guess what? I got to find $150,000. She goes, oh, good luck with that. So stability is a good word, if we can go for that. But over stability, if you gave me a choice of stability or up, I'll take up.
To wind things up, I think we do have many challenges in public education. And when I was on the school board in New Berlin, our superintendent always said, well, you can either see it as a challenge or something negative or as an opportunity. I think we do have some opportunities during this time of change. I think we are poised to do great things in public education in Wisconsin, but we need to have a funding and finance system and cooperation so that we can get us over the top so that we can achieve greatness. I think we have an opportunity. We're starting to see it at Racine Unified, where we had a very difficult performing district with very troubling achievements statistics. We are seeing graduation rates go up, achievement gaps closing, number of great things going on. That can happen all over the state, and if we cooperate, work together, and have a financing system that helps provide adequacy for reaching those goals rather than just another anchor and negative challenge. So I look forward to those challenges as we continue to help our students achieve.
So I think, if there's a theme that came out of today, stability and consistency are probably it. And, as we think about kind of how to meet these challenges moving forward, and I think there are big ones, I think we've got to get through the state budget and be sort of thoughtful, hopefully, in how that all comes together and where it moves us forward. And then I think there are two options. I mean, folks can dig in and really look at all these complicated policy issues, or the legislature could gavel out and not come back, and we all might be better for that at the end of the day. I think, we really struggled with the ping-ponging effect of all the different issues, from where do we want to go on assessment, and should we have more or should we have less? Should we have local decisions? Should we have state decisions? How much is the federal government going to be on this? And you can go down every series of issues. And I think what we're hearing from schools is, let us educate kids. We're actually pretty good at this, and we can do a great job at this, but let's just be really thoughtful about how we're going to move those pieces forward and do a lot of the legwork. I mean, symposiums like this and, bringing in legislators and really digging into the complicated issues of finance and licensure and all those things. Sometimes just one-shot legislative hearings, not a great place to work out complicated issues. The folks that are engaging on this, and several of them are here in the room, I mean, we need them to stay engaged and get really deep in how these things work, because, solutions are hard to come by, and we're going to need help in doing that.
First of all, thanks for having us, and thanks to Marquette. I'm a proud Marquette alumni, so it's always good to be back on campus. Rapid fire response for a 1-minute time frame, but let's provide certainty in our schools. We need to do that by getting some Medicaid flexibility, because that's where our pressure lies in the budget. And then there's a lot of things we could do by just lifting the onerous requirements on our schools. Let's get rid of the school start date. Let's get rid of prevailing wage for our local schools. Let them decide at their local level if they want to do prevailing wage. Let's look at the funding formula and provide more equity in there. There's a lot of mandates in our schools from the state that don't have to be there, that still provide tremendous flexibility and provide certainty of funding. I think our schools will be in a good spot. But I think I'll end it with this, is that our gap between minority graduation rates and the rest of the state has significantly narrowed the last 4 years. Our graduation rate is up, and our ACT scores are up. So let's focus on the outputs, let's provide certainty, and let's keep going forward, because no matter what issue you're talking about, if you're talking about our economy, or you're talking about healthcare, or you're talking about whatever it is, it all comes down to K through 12 education. So let's double down. Let's not be content with the status quo and keep innovating. Thank you.
Representative Dale Kuanga, Jeff Pirtle, Mark Duff, Emily Casella, Todd Berry, thank you all for being part of this and this stimulating conversation. We are going to take a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 10:35 or maybe even 6, but not later than that. Testing and low-performing schools and accountability. Excellent panels.
I think we'll get underway with the introductions today. First of all, my name is Mike Goucher, and this panel we have entitled Testing, How Can We Tell How Kids Are Doing? A lot of conversation about testing right now, and this is the way this will work. We have about 50 minutes. This panel will take about 40 minutes to talk about testing and a variety of issues and questions, and then we hope to have about 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. We all think that'd be a great thing to have happen. Let me do this as the remainder of the folks are being seated. Let me briefly tell you about our panelists here today, and we are delighted they could be with us. Brad Carl, the gentleman seated next to me, is Associate Director and Researcher at the Value Added Research Center, Wisconsin Center for Education Research at UW-Madison. Brad's current work focuses on the design, implementation, and evaluation of state educator effectiveness and school accountability systems. Seated next to Brad is Pat DeClotz. She is the superintendent of the Kettle Moraine School District, which has about 4,200 students. Superintendent DeClotz is completing her 9th year at Kettle Moraine. State Senator Paul Farrow is a Republican lawmaker from Pewaukee. He is the Assistant Majority Leader, and he is chair of the Senate Committee on Education Reform. He will soon leave the legislature, and are you going to be done in July? Is that it? Yeah, in July. He's going to focus on his new job as Waukesha County Executive. Sally Flashberger is a special education advocate with disability rights in Wisconsin. In that role, she has been working to support students and families in southeast Wisconsin for the past 6 years. Thanks, Sally. And Amy Mizialko is Director of Teaching and Learning for the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association. She has been a special education teacher in MPS, has mentored young teachers, and she is the incoming Vice President of the MTEA. Thanks to our panelists for being with us today. So we intend this to be a conversation. I'm going to play the role of traffic cop, start, stop, this way, don't, no, a lot of that going on. But I'd like to bring everybody into the discussion with the starting question. And, I guess let's start here. Since 2002, it's been a law nationwide that we're going to test kids in 3rd through 8th grade once a year, once in high school. We're going to do that to find out how they're doing. I'd like to hear each of you answer the question, what have we learned from this since 2002? Brad Carl, I guess I'll begin with you since you're sitting next to me. Lucky guy that you are. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So at risk of making maybe the understatement of the year, there's a lot in the air these days with respect to testing, and the question that you've asked is an appropriate place to start. We've been engaged in large-scale testing since 2002, and there's a fair question around what have we learned so far. So we've learned some things like there are big achievement gaps, and we've learned that there is there are opportunities to measure student performance in different ways, including point-in-time measures. We do proficiency rates and those kinds of things. There are opportunities to measure student performance through growth measures. And so I think what all of these point to now is we're having some very appropriate and arguably long overdue conversations around what is the appropriate role of testing as we think about how we how we measure school performance, how we measure performance at the individual educator level. There are questions around what kind of tests we should use for what purposes. I think one of the things we've learned is that different tests give us different sets of information, and they have different time frames associated with them. Some are given once a year, some are given more often than that. What tests are aligned to content standards, and so we have a very robust discussion going around. We don't, in contrast to how the discussions around testing sometimes proceed, we don't start with tests, we start with content standards. And so, these are the expectations. Here's what we want kids to know and be able to do, and we develop tests that measure whether students know those or not. So, we're having some conversations around how well different tests can serve multiple purposes, and then I think we're seeing, and I'll stop here, there are some real limits to what test-based accountability can accomplish for us. So I think I'll leave it at that. that for now.
Superintendent DeClotz.
Sure. I think we've learned a great deal since 2002. And not to reiterate all that Brad has said, I would agree with everything he said there, but we've also learned how to use data from tests. We've learned how to bring educators together, and we've learned we need more data than we're getting from state tests. So many districts are using growth measures already now, which is why at one point it was very exciting to think that the state could take that burden for us and we wouldn't have to test twice to get the information that we really need to know in order to meet students where they are. I would say another really important thing that we've learned is that tests don't measure everything, and that academic achievement is only one pillar of defining student success post-secondary, and that there are some very real needs to measure engagement and to measure college and career readiness. So as we look at the debate on state testing right now, I would say it's probably not the biggest decision in the world, and that there are bigger things to consider when we can look at how are we equipping and preparing our children to be successful post K-12 education.
Senator Farrell.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having us here. I guess I'm going to go at a little bit different route. As a politician, why are we doing this, politicians? And I think that's the key. When you look back at NCLB and what we tried to accomplish, we were supposed to be 100% proficient by last year in all the schools, the tests. We didn't look at an effective outcome. We just came up with an idea and, okay, let's do it. And then here, by the way, you guys got to take care of that. And Pat and I have had a lot of conversations about how wonderful we are up at the state level on coming out with great ideas. But I think that's part of what we need to do right now, and I think that's what's been exciting about the last couple of years is we're having a greater conversation about what we're trying to accomplish, what we're looking for. And when you look at the assessments, we had a hearing last week in a unique situation. I had the director of a public schools association and the president of a voucher school sitting together saying what we need is effective assessments. We need knowledge that's going to give us what we can use to get our kids better. And then we need the state and the federal government to allow us to do this, and let's figure the whole package out. I think that was one of the key moments that you looked at is this is an important piece for everybody across the board. There are systems that are out there that people are using that are effective, and we need to make sure that we can capitalize on that, not recreate a whole new process.
Sally Fletchberger.
I come at it from a little different perspective, being from disability rights, and so the one thing that we've seen is that there are high expectations for students with disabilities, and that before the students with disabilities were not necessarily given tests, and so parents were unable to tell where their students were achieving. And with that high expectation, school districts have moved the needle for students with disabilities. We still have some work to do. It's also allowed students with disabilities to have greater access to the general education curriculum. That was also part of the changes. So while testing we still don't know what's going to happen with testing, we definitely see that those high expectations for students with disabilities has been a big improvement.
Amy Mizielko.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here this morning. So in terms of what we've learned over the past little more than a decade, I'm going to speak as a teacher. That's what I am for 23 years in Milwaukee Public Schools, and I'm a special education teacher. Testing has nearly tripled in the past 13 years. A child who begins in kindergarten and graduates in 12th grade will sit for over 100 standardized testing assessments. And currently in Milwaukee, what we've seen happen around testing is that children who are most under-resourced, who start life with the fewest advantages and privileges, are involved in a hyper-assessment arena. And there are costs to that. And the cost to students, and I'm going to speak again as a special education teacher, is the cost of individualized instruction, and the cost for English language learners, for children who don't speak English as their first language and are learning English and who are desperately trying to get career and college ready. The cost for them is extra testing, less time for instruction. So I would say that what we've learned is what we already knew, is that children who come from families that have advantages and privileges, like the family that I came from a home with 2 working parents. Not 2 college-educated parents, but 2 working parents. And those families who have family-supporting jobs and who have opportunity to housing and health care, their kids do better in school. And kids who don't come from those advantages largely continue to struggle. So we know what we've always known, that our kids need more resources.
Is there consensus on this panel that there's too much testing taking place right now, or is there not consensus on that? Any of you can feel free to jump in here and take these questions.
I'll
Sure.
start with a comment that there was a paper done last fall by the Center for American Progress that estimated that the amount of time spent on testing, and this is district and state required tests, was 1.6% of instructional hours. Now, having said that, it's appropriate to caveat that that doesn't account for test prep, which there's a lot of consensus that districts are spending too much time on that. It actually doesn't pay off really that much. That doesn't fully account for the disruptiveness, particularly as we move to computer adaptive testing, having to swap out, computer lab time. That's a significant distinction. But I think the important question is, and I would say it's a very appropriate and overdue discussion around, do we test too much? I think the caution that I would offer is, collectively, what do we give and what do we give up if we made testing if we rolled it back to, say, 4, 8, and 10, which is what we had before? And one thing we'd give up there would be the ability to measure growth, for example.
We'll continue to follow that, but anybody else, Superintendent?
Sure, and I think that part of that answer lies in the fact that we now have different ways of giving tests or measures of progress, and measures of progress are extremely important to help teachers to do that personalization, which again, I think the technology tools that we have available today allow us to differentiate the expectations for each and every student, not just students with disabilities, our highly gifted, our middle of the road. What we know about education or learning is that it's not linear. People come at it and they have strengths and they have areas of needs, and measuring progress or testing in a way that recognizes what those student needs are, that allows a teacher to differentiate her approach or his approach and offer that acceleration or additional support so that you can assure that kids are meeting a competency. Simply going through the seat is not sufficient for the children that are in our schools. We have to be able to build an education system that allows all children to succeed, regardless of their ability or disability, and testing is just one part of that. But before No Child Left Behind, introduced MAP assessment in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so we could see that growth, and so we could see the areas of need. So again, we have tools now that allow us to dig deep into the individual students' skills and abilities and to help support them in their learning journey without giving them a label that tells them where their limits are. So I would say, I don't know if it's too much testing. If we don't use the data, it's absolutely too much. Any test that isn't used is worthless.
I'd like to get something from each of you, Sally, and from Senator Farrell.
Well, yeah, I think when you look at it again, too much testing, it's not so much the test itself, is the impact on the time in the school. When you look at, and I love it when the email comes home, we're going to do testing tomorrow, so make sure your kid gets a good night's sleep and gets something to eat today, because it's more important that he's ready tomorrow instead of the rest of the time. But you look at teachers, you look at the impact of the teachers that are trying to prep for this, get it ready. And we've seen a lot of issues with the rollout of the Smarter Balance. And you're looking at a change in how we're applying the whole process. But I think that's one of the impacts that we have to look at, is how is it affecting the education cycle throughout the year? If they have to break suddenly to take a test, then they can't do anything else during this week because the kids have been stressed out over the test, so we're going to take time off of that. How do we correlate all that in to getting the right data, the right information that we need? I think that's one of the key components. When you looked at the Smarter Balance, one of the districts that I had said it's about 500 minutes worth of testing time that doesn't include the practice time. Now, DPI came out and said that, no, we dropped that down because 2 of the components we're not going to utilize. So we're saving you time. But if we didn't, drop those 2 out, we still would have had all that we were going to be working on.
Go ahead.
I think too that's like Pat said. I think the big thing is that we have districts who are doing their local testing, which is so effective to change the course for a student in a quarter, whether they're doing the MAP testing 3 times a year. So they really can't affect the student. I think when I think about the state testing and is this too much, I always think from the parent perspective. And how can you compare what your child's doing, in your school district or voucher schools or charter schools? When I think about parents having a choice and knowing what it looks like across the state, if we eliminate that, then we're not comparing apples to apples. So it is a very difficult question. I think that the effectiveness of individual districts who are using their district tests to move the needle is so important. So it's hard to say which, anyone can give up.
It's interesting to me that I think Senator Farrow and Amy Mazzialko, you kind of share the same point of view on this, that there may be too much in the way of tests. And the question then becomes, what do we do in lieu of these tests? And Amy Mazzialko, I'll begin with you. Where do we go? Rather than, if we don't test, what do we do?
So teachers love tests. We invented them. Okay? So let's just go back to all of that. What students don't deserve is a learning environment that is entirely focused on test preparation or testing. So when I began my career in 1992 in Milwaukee Public Schools, my colleagues and I engaged our students in developmentally appropriate, performance-based tests that we did throughout the school year. I can clearly remember the writing assessments that we gave, and I can clearly remember getting together in really professional learning communities and scoring and discussing the results of our students' writing. And what that did for me as a young teacher was it made me a much better instructor of writing. And it gave me information, data, to take back into my classroom on Monday about my students and how to differentiate and really tailor writing instruction so that my students could become the best writers that they could be. So we want smart testing, and we also want to pay attention to who's tested and who isn't. There are certain folks who, by way of advantage and privilege, are able to move their children out of this hyper-assessment arena. They can move them to schools where this is not happening. President Obama has opted his children out of testing. And he did that because he can purchase them an education that allows his children to not be part of this toxic testing regime. So please understand that teachers want tests. We want tests that are smart. And we want an experience for our children, for our students, that looks at them as whole human beings and not just a few different numbers that are generated.
Superintendent Klotz, you're nodding in agreement.
They're very wise people up here with me. It's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking that in a time when we have a lot of testing, Kettle Moraine opted to do an additional test.
Yeah, tell us about that. That's interesting. You're not just, you want to know how you're faring against the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and there are other districts in the room here that also participated in that assessment, but the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, back in 2000 started administering a test among nations in order to give people an idea of where they stood. And those results have been used to write a number of books. And one of the things that was sorely lacking was an ability for a school district to know where they stood. I know that my kids, my students here in Kettle Moraine, will be competing in a global society. There's no getting away from that. It will be a global society. Technology has done that for our country. We cannot be just focused on how Kettle Moraine kids perform in the United States, let alone in Wisconsin, let alone Waukesha County. So those comparables are used, but what really matters is, will they be successful in a global society? Now, this is a very different test because it doesn't test every child. It's really a test that informs the school district. We get a random sample of 85 students, and it's a 3.5-hour test, so it's not days, and it doesn't just measure literacy or math or science, although you get scores in those areas. When I gave test samples to my board members, they thought that the reading test was actually a mathematics test and vice versa. So it's applied thinking and problem solving. It's the critical skills that our employers are looking for, and it gives you great diagnostics. Again, a test is only good if you can use the data to improve opportunities for children, improve a teacher's opportunity to know how to best equip those children. So we took an extra test.
So that's interesting. So but let's talk about the test that sort of everyone's supposed to be taking right now, the Badger exam. And now see, look at that reaction out there. It is a hot button issue. People do not like this test. What's wrong with the Badger exam? Anybody?
Well, I will say one thing that we saw that was concerning is the test wasn't ready appropriately, and that it wasn't going to level at the way that it had been proposed to. So the leveling from a student receiving special ed or a student with disability, any student, it was going to, you answer a question, it gets harder, then it goes back up and down. And so that wasn't available. So we thought that was a pretty important part. We also think some of the accessibility options and the issues with universal design were not prepared for this testing window either. So there's definitely, and that's a national issue. That is not just, here in Wisconsin. Those are some of the issues nationally with the test.
Anybody else in this panel have problems with the Badger exam as it's currently configured and would be not terribly unhappy if it went away?
Well, so I'm going to sidestep that question just for a second and say I think this is a good cautionary tale, though, as we look to what is the future of assessment in this state going to look like next year, the following year, 3-5 years down the road. Almost inevitably, when there is the rollout of a major new assessment system, there are always hiccups in the rollout. And so one of the questions we need to consider as a state is, again, if we're prepared next year to have, are we prepared to move to a permanent assessment, or are we going to have one more stopgap assessment and then move on to something permanent? It's a really important question.
Yes, I think the rollout is one of the issues. This was started in 2010. We're going to have 4 years to get this completed. And as you go along piece by piece, we find out that it's not exactly what we thought it was to begin with. And then we thought this was a turnkey operation. Quietly, it's not going to be completely turnkey. There's 4 or 5 different companies that are doing this part, that part. They're working through this. And we were always given excuses. And we were never, I remember last summer when we were talking about accountability. We had an individual in the room sit down and say, well, the great part about this is there's going to be an interim component that's going to go with this. And I said, well, don't we already have that in a MAPS test or the STARS test? And they said, well, yeah, but this is different. And I said, okay, so why can't we use these 2 tests for the summative component of the Smarter Balance? Well, you can't do that because you don't want to differentiate, you want to, pardon my French, bastardize these 2 tests in what knowledge and capabilities we're doing. And this is the same person who's just telling me, but we're going to have an interim test that Smarter Balance is going to develop for us. And so they're trying to fit all these pieces together with this one puzzle, and it's not working. And I think it goes back to when you hear up here, we're talking about what information do we need. I think that's what we should be looking at. What is the information we need for the tests? What do we need for our accountability component? And then what are we going to use to look at educator effectiveness? Once we have that knowledge and understanding, then let's look at a vehicle that we're going to get that information from.
Is this exam, the Badger exam, dead as far as you're concerned? This will be the last year we'll see of it. Senator?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So can I just add that the Smarter Balanced Assessment is a part of an issue. So standardized testing has gone from being a nuisance to a concern to a crisis. We're at a crisis now. And Brad's referring to hiccups in the Smarter Balance rollout. When there are high stakes attached to a system that is full of hiccups, and those high stakes result in closing schools and declaring schools and the people who teach in them failures, then we've hit the crisis point. So the high stakes associated and the high stakes decisions associated with Smarter Balanced and the portfolio of assessments that our students are now being given in Milwaukee in particular, this is a crisis.
Anybody have anything to, do you share that view? Does anybody feel it's a crisis? Are we at that stage?
Kettle Moraine is in a different place. I'm just going to say that. We piloted the Smarter Balanced Assessment test 2 years in a row, so we were on the front edge of saying, what is it and how are we going to have to change? And what I saw the first year was questions that were far better, far deeper, that required kids to think and that did not turn them off to a paper and pencil test because it was adaptive. We didn't see any of those results second year because of the validation of the test items. But, is it a struggle? Is it more than we want? Yeah, right now it's definitely in a learning curve. I don't know why when implemented, all of those things. But what I know is that going to a one-size-fits-all, let's measure the middle, isn't going to give us the data that we want, and we're still going to be giving an adaptive test. So I think it behooves us as a state to say, what is that information that we want our children to have or to know from our children, for our teachers to use, to share with our parents, and being able to measure not just achievement, but also growth is critically important, especially when you consider some of the subpopulations. If you have an English language learner, it's pretty ridiculous to expect that they're going to be proficient in a test that's in a foreign language until they have that proficiency established.
Are we going to be able to agree on a new test? I mean, you do have different people in this room have different points of view about what's the proper amount of testing, the kind of information we're looking for, even who should take the tests. Are we going to be able to agree on what should be in a test that can be used by many and can be understood by the general public? Is it possible, given some of the politics of today and given some of the concerns?
I think it's possible. I think
what are you looking at? You say it's possible. What are you looking at?
I think it's getting the feedback from the informational hearing that I had last week, that we had in the Senate, and talking with the different districts in my area, talking with different districts around the region. What we're looking for is, one, a component that people are comfortable and familiar with and can understand, and two, it comes back to let's reauthorize ESEA effectively to figure out who's going to be doing the assessments and why. Once we get that clarification, and I think that's one of the biggest problems we have when we look at our educational system, is we're waiting for the feds to determine what they want to do. Then we've got to wait for DPI to determine how they're going to implement what they perceive the feds want us to do. And then we give it to the local schools who are constrained by what the legislature decides we should be doing also. When we get through all those three pieces, I think we've got it. In talking with people, I think there are components, there are tests that are out here that people would agree are effective. We look at the ACT testing that we've been using in the high schools. The Aspire program is an effective program. There's still some hiccups that are there. We look at NWEA with the MAPS test. We look at Renaissance with the STAR program. There are pieces that are there that I think we're closer than we believe. We just have to get on the same page across the board. The only way to do that is to have more conversations like this that are effective.
Senator Flashberger.
Well, I think the thing is that we're not going to get rid of a test. There's going to be a test. The federal government's going to require that test. I think that one of the things that is concerning is who are we going to test? And so we've seen with the ESEA that they're talking, they were talking about eliminating the percentage of students with disabilities that have to be tested. We think that's going to move in the right direction now, so that we are still testing the majority of our students with the same standardized test. I think the other thing is there's such a discussion of the school accountability and having accountability across all of the different schools, whether it's a choice school, a charter school, and a public school. And so, you think about a test and how can we ever compare those apples to apples unless we pick one effective test for everyone. If we have multiple testing that, maybe a voucher school chooses this, a public school chooses, even within public schools, they could possibly pick a different test than another public school. And not having that apples to apples comparison, I think, will just be something else that makes it much more complicated.
Brad Carl, do you have anything to add to that? Do we need one test rather than multiple tests?
So I think the most straightforward way to think of this is, particularly when results from an assessment, when we're clear that we're going to be using those for high-stakes purposes, the most straightforward comparisons are made when everyone takes the same test. Now, are there ways to equate results from different tests? Yes, there are, but those rest on a set of assumptions around some commonality around things like, it's challenging from a technical standpoint to, compare results from two tests that might be aligned to the same content standards, but if we have different content standards upon which the tests are built, and then there are differences in administration conditions, there are test A is given with accommodations for students with disabilities and a translated version for English language learners, and test B is not. There are, the challenges spiral very, very quickly.
Just to add to that, I think when we focus on how does a test serve students, we'll make the right decision. And when we focus on anything other than that, we're probably going to be making mistakes. The idea of one test is really critical in my mind, again, just to be transparent. Without one test, you introduce all kinds of variables and excuses and finger pointing and reasons, and suddenly you don't have clarity. I learned a great deal about correlation in my doctoral work, and one of the things that I'll never forget is there's an extremely high correlation between the sale of ice cream and crime. Extremely high. So if we just stop selling ice cream, right? Don't mention that it might have something to do with temperature, right? The temperature when sales of ice cream skyrockets. Yeah, okay. So same thing. I mean, if we really want to be transparent in the work that we're doing in serving students, not serving test companies, not serving administrators, not serving politicians, let's look at one test and make it transparent for parents.
Amy Mizialko.
I very much agree with Pat that when we are focused on, and our orientation is children, then we might have a chance. We might. And the notion, this idea that finding the right test will do something for children is really misguided.
How so? Why is that misguided?
So I want a broader conception of accountability, okay? I'm here for 79,000 Milwaukee Public School students and hundreds of thousands of Wisconsin Public School students. And they need and they deserve a broader conception of accountability. So when when we're in here in like our suits and our like fancy breakfast, we have kids who are going to take a test who don't own a mattress. Okay? And so for us to get so kind of in this discussion about, finding the right test is like what we owe our kids. What we owe our kids is far more and far broader. And so I want more accountability for the children of the state and the children of my city, because they deserve that. They deserve more than this small discussion about continually measuring what we already know, that kids who suffer in poverty, in generational poverty, are going to do worse than my nephews. And that's not okay.
Well, let me play devil's advocate, though. I mean, we heard from the Racine district, and talking about, and actually from Superintendent Evers, about some of the progress they've made towards erasing the racial achievement gap. Certainly, they've learned that through testing. Is that not the case? I mean, wouldn't they know that? Are they not catering courses or approaches based in part on the tests?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, the literature has established another term for the achievement gap, and that's the opportunity gap. And further, another iteration of that is an opportunity debt, that we have a debt that we owe our students. I can tell you that there are tens of thousands of incredibly committed, hardworking teachers who work with parents and families who are nothing short of miracle workers doing what they do with what they have, and we see some growth. To imagine that I, as a teacher, with my doctorate and my experience and my ability to make good relationships with families, to imagine that that is the whole picture or even half of the picture of a child's achievement, it isn't. You can pin about 14% of it on me. And you know what? Give me all 14%. I'll own all 14%, and I bet you I can get 15, 16, or 17. But it's not the whole picture. There are so many more pieces.
Let me wrap up this part of it, and we'll take a couple of questions from the audience. So, as professionals, what is the best way to measure the progress of our students, of our kids? What are we not doing that we should be doing? Anybody can go first.
I'm going to try to answer the question that you titled this session on. How can we tell how our kids are doing?
Yeah.
Novel idea. Let's talk to our kids. You know, I think that we have such an extreme focus on academics, and kind of building on what was just said. We know that success in life is based on more than academics. There are valedictorians that are not very successful, and there are kids that are BC kids, CD kids that are absolutely flying in their professional careers. So it's more than just academics. You know, my board has a definition of student achievement that's defined by 3 pillars. Academic excellence for all, regardless of your continuum. Growth for a year's time is 1. Citizenship, personal development. I think those are equally compelling and probably more important when you look at post-secondary experience. And I think that we need to pay attention to how do we value that person that's the student, not just give them a measure of academic achievement, because they have a responsibility beyond high school, and they will be our society in the very near future.
So?
I guess I agree with Pat, and because I think about the student, and you know, I think the goal is what are they going to do when they leave school, and that we should be preparing that student from kindergarten. And I think that those local school districts are great at determining what that progress is from the student on that daily basis, whether it's you know, changing up the differentiation because this student needs that. And so I do think we're going to have testing. There's just there's no way around it. But to really have a student be successful, we have to start from early on talking to them about what is it that you want to be, who do you want to be, not where are you going to go to college, you know, but who do you want to be, what do you see yourself being, and starting that early on with our students.
Best way to measure progress that we're maybe not doing right now or could be doing more of? Senator?
Well, coming from a parent, you know, when I look at it, I have a student who got a 31 on his ACT. He's got an F in math. Now, I say that because I'm very similar to he was. I was a C student in high school. You learn to apply yourself in different ways. I'm not a test taker. I don't like to take tests. There's a lot of kids out there that don't like to take tests. So when we start putting high achievement, high rewards on tests, kids don't have the buy-in for them. As Pat said, what do the kids know? You ask the kids questions, they know what they want to do. Again, my same student, he's got ADHD. Dad's only got ADD, so I'm pretty good. But in 4th grade, he was told once you finish the test, you get to read a book. He was done on the test in 10 minutes because he wants to read the book. Those are the things that we have to struggle with and we're looking at. Let's get back to what we were supposed to do, where we have effective teachers who work with the kids in a classroom and help them grow. The achievements that we see at different schools and different programs, you can see 1.5 year growth from a student in one school compared to another because of the atmosphere around the school. The assessments are supposed to be our secondary, hey, just to check to see how we're doing. But right now, they are the primary key. We've got to do everything to the assessment. And by the way, Amy, you're a wonderful teacher. We don't need you to do anything other than teach to the test. And then that takes all of her skills away from her. And that's what I think we've got to start realizing is, how do we get back to that?
Amy, you want to respond to that, and then I'll give Brad the final word here.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in what's the best way to measure a kid's progress.
So, returning to a broad lens conception of assessment where we look at authentic, developmentally appropriate, performance-based assessments for our kids is where I would like to see us go. Going back to grade span as opposed to annual is a place that I'd like to see us go. And I appreciate the story about wanting to read the amazing novel, so getting done with the test quickly. Here's the other side of that spectrum. The other side of that spectrum is that almost all of my students with individualized education plans with disabilities, primarily learning disabilities, have extended time to take their assessments. And I worked with my students, I looped with them 3-4 years. By the time when you spent that much time with a child, you are locked in. You have 1,000 days together. You can do a lot with children in that amount of time. And so what do I teach them? I teach them to persist and persevere. And do you know what that means when they take a test? They try and try and they keep going and they won't stop even though it's hard and they won't stop even though it's 2 or 3 or 4 years beyond their performance level. And so they sit for inordinate amounts of time trying really hard to do something that is really and truly a waste of their time at a particular point and robs me of the opportunity to sit with that child, sit with those children, and give them the individualized instruction that they deserve and they need to make progress.
Brad Carl, I'll give you the final word. Is there a better way of measuring progress than what we've been doing?
Well, I think if you think about, maybe circle back to the question we started with, which is here we are 12, 13 years into test-based accountability. We've learned that there are limitations. We've learned, when we talk about how test data are used, one thing I think has been very clear as a theme here is that there are tests and then there are how tests are used. And I think one thing we've done a very poor job of is communicating and understanding that different tests produce different kinds of information that are useful for different purposes. And so I'm a big fan of measuring growth. One thing I think we've learned from many years of No Child Left Behind is when we take test results and report those in terms of proficiency, what we essentially get is a rank ordering of schools by poverty rate. And so that's telling us something important, right? But it's not necessarily telling us anything new, and it might not be the optimal measure for, again, what we should do with all of this stuff is start with the question, what do we need an accountability system, a test-based system and an accountability system to do, and then, backfill from there.
Let me take a couple questions from the audience real quickly before we wrap things up. If you have one, if you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the little ball, but on the rim. I see one back there. Yes.
Yeah, one of the things that I tend to see is that when we're looking at accountability, we try new things, which is fantastic, and we should. But then we go, if we properly train teachers and if we give them enough time to get well acquainted enough to really implement things effectively, what ends up happening is when that process may be a multi-year process, after 9 months or one school year, it's like, oh no, it didn't work, hurry, let's try something new. And then the same process repeats, and then we never know what actually works because we're switching gears so quickly that nothing has time to get a foothold. So how do we maintain the urgency around accountability while maybe injecting a tiny bit of patience to let things actually work out and see if they work over, a longer time frame?
Anybody like to take a swing at that one? Yes.
Well, I will say I have been participating in some of the discussions in the state about results-driven accountability. And so that's where we're kind of moving. And I recently was at a DPI meeting where we talked about implementation science. And so I think that from the state level, they are looking at ways because of so many initiatives that they can clearly bring guidance and direction starting at the state level, down regional, into the local school districts about what initiatives do we have, what's working, what do we need to put to the side to work on results-driven accountability. And through that process, this implementation science, because that's what it's all about, the fidelity. And it's no good if a school district starts and then they can't continue with fidelity. So I do think there's some promise out there for that.
Just to build on that, I would like to kind of repeat something that Emily said in the previous panel, that we have some of the best educators I've ever seen in my life working in our schools right now. And we need to create an environment where they feel supported and that it is safe for them to reach out and try to do new things, to improve the student learning opportunities without a concern about punishment. So I am very much committed to elevating the respect of educators across our great state because they are doing a tremendous job. Do we have more work to do? Heck yeah, I believe in continuous improvement, and we can use test data to help do that, but we've got 90-day or 100-day plans that we use to look at individual students, because you know what? A kid that just lost his mom is not going to do real well in the next few months, and that's okay. That doesn't mean he's stupid or not trying. It means he's dealing with life. And educators help our kids navigate life. When you talk about not having a mattress, it's pretty hard to look at a standardized test when you were sleeping in a car. So, I really believe that one of the commentators mentioned that both our advocates and our adversaries of public education both talk about how badly we're doing. We need to change the conversation and celebrate the great work that's happening in the state of Wisconsin.
Very briefly. Mm-hmm.
Just a quick, we need vision. When you look at it, I know a lot of the school districts, a lot of people do strategic planning, and they figure out what the plan is for this year's budget for next year, and they try to figure out a 5 and 10 year strategic plan. But then we try to look at a vision. What are we trying to accomplish with education? In our state, we have a unique situation that we have a superintendent of public instruction that is an elected official. A lot of states have a school board where they get input, they get feedback. One of the concerns that I've always had is you go to DPI with ideas, suggestions, and it kind of goes in, something happens, and then it comes out. And there's very little transparency that we see as we go through the process. I would love to see us have a 5-year vision for what we're looking at for education and put it out there and then try to sit back and say, okay, federal government, let us do it, state, let us do it, and let us get on a path.
I'm going to wrap things up there. We're going to move right on to the next panel, but I would like to thank our panelists, Amy Mizialko, Sally Flashberger, Senator Farrell, Superintendent DeClotz, and Brett Carl. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We are pleased to have the last session, which will focus on what to do about whatever we call low success schools. I never am comfortable with a label for them. And we're pleased to have Professor Robert Lowe from the College of Education here. as the moderator. I want to thank him for his participation, and he will introduce the panel.
Thank you. Am I audible? Not used to this. I got some training from Mike Goucher and Ellen Borsick, and I'm absolutely certain I'm going to violate everything they told me, and at the very least be kind of bumpy to Mike's smoothness. I'm so pleased to be here. I think this is an incredibly important topic about addressing the problems of low-performing schools. This is a terrific panel in terms of its experience. I'm going to offer very, very brief introductions that don't really get at the richness of all of that experience. I hope you don't mind. To my right is Darian Driver, the superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools. To her right is April Knox, the director of coaching for schools that can. And then Jeremy Thiesfield, a member of the State Assembly and chair of the Assembly Education Committee. And finally, Mandela Barnes, also a member of the State Assembly and a member of the Education Committee as well. Welcome. What I'm going to try to do is set a little context before I get into this. This may not work. I'm going to do a history of American education in about 90 seconds. So I expect a lot of nuance here. Through much of our history, schools were really not very involved with academic achievement. They were concerned with morality, civility, cultural transmission. And it's only really in the 20th century that with increasing linkages between schools and the labor market, achievement began to really matter. The better you did in school and the farther you went, the more likely you were to end up in favored positions in an increasingly stratified labor market. But what was essential to all of this is that the assumption was that students succeeded or failed based on what they brought, their ability and their effort. And if overall patterns of achievement reflected patterns of socioeconomic difference, well, so what? You know, that was sort of to be expected. What's extraordinary about the recent educational reform movement is it seeks to break the linkage between socioeconomic background and academic achievement and hold schools primarily responsible for making that happen. This is unbelievably powerful and unbelievably demanding as well, because schools were never really designed to do that. And consequently, when we see that the mandate of No Child Left Behind to engender proficiency in English, in reading, and math, by the year 2014 didn't even come close to taking place, that shouldn't be a huge surprise. So in that context, which you can accept actually or not, I'd like to open this with this query. If you are able to succeed with low-performing schools, what realistically would that look like? And I'll start with Dr. Driver.
Well, good morning, Bob, and good morning to everyone. In terms of what success looks like and what good schools would look like in terms of turning around low-performing schools. We really believe a lot of this starts at the top in terms of the supports that we give to our principals, really being able to set that vision, that mission around what we want to see all of our students be able to achieve, to know and to learn by the time they leave that school. You'd want the teachers and the staff to be able to function as one cohesive team, so there's clear structures and systems in place and routines for our students to be able to follow. If you go into a classroom, being able to see differentiation at all levels, and that's ed speak. But what it really means is that students are being challenged at their level and above their level to make sure that they're getting the most out of all of the standards that are being taught to them. There's a good balance between the co-curricular activities like art and music and physical education, as well as what you would want to see in terms of reading and mathematics and social studies and science. And at the end of the day, can we measure that it's working? And you measure that in a number of different ways. seeing that students are engaged in what they're learning, that they're able to take that away into their communities, that you're able to measure it in terms of reading and math proficiency and attendance and all of those kinds of things. But are they graduating? Are they able to get jobs or go into college when they're done? That's how you really know that all of those different pieces, those recipes that we're putting in place are working.
Great, thank you. And by the way, please feel free to respond to each other, because it's supposed to be a round table. The table a little bit. April, next.
Well, thank you again for having me here this morning. I think Dr. Driver covered a great deal of that. Traditionally, when we're thinking about, particularly in the United States, this achievement gap in low-performing schools, we're thinking about a gap between students with low SES and students who aren't low SES, socioeconomic status, and we're also thinking about the black-white achievement gap. I think what I would add to that is, are we preparing students to be globally competitive? So going to and through college, and then being able to compete outside of the United States and be able to compete in the global marketplace.
Representative Thiesman.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that I've always prescribed to when you look at what would you recognize a school that is being a good school is that you have not only products that are coming out, the students that are coming out that can fill the workforce locally, because that certainly is important. But it has been long-standing tradition in schools in the United States of America that we are producing good, solid citizens coming out of those schools too. People that when they get into adulthood are going to be engaged in their community in a variety of ways, not just through employment, but in all the other areas that we expect Americans to be involved in our community, whether it be serving on boards, on committees, or even just attending those meetings as in some sort of a supervisory capacity like citizens are supposed to do in the United States. Schools should be places where kids want to be. They enjoy the presence of being there. They enjoy the presence of the teachers. You have teachers who want to be at the school because they see students who are responsive to what it is that they're teaching to them. And they also see parents that are actively engaged in the process. Those are the most important things we can have when we're looking at whether a school is successfully engaging the children of its community. Are they actually engaging the entire community as well?
Thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone who came out this morning, afternoon. One of the biggest things I would say when we look at a lower performing school, what does it mean to be a low performing school? Like, what is the actual definition of a low performing school? It's a school that has a significant population of its students who aren't meeting certain achievement goals. Well, why aren't those students meeting those goals is another question that should be asked, and it's a question that's rarely asked because there are barriers to education that we seemingly ignore all the time when we try to answer how should a school perform, how should a school be reformed. And when you look at MPS, for example, Milwaukee Public Schools, and when you look at the challenges that are presented with a lot of our schools, some of the biggest factors are child poverty, right? The biggest factor, the single biggest factor when it comes to student performance. When you look at a number, 1 in 19 students in MPS is homeless, that's something to really think about. Of course they won't be competitive with Glendale River Hill School District. Of course they won't be competitive with Brown Deer School District because the socioeconomic factors are different. And when we look at education, if we don't address that issue, if we don't address those types of issues, whether it's student health, mental or physical health, we won't see any difference in the outcome of our students because those bottom line issues haven't been met. We haven't addressed the core factors that affect the student's performance. So when I say, what does a lower performing school look like? How do we change that? We have to change so much else to put a child in a position to be able to learn. You can't learn if you go to school hungry. You can't learn if you go to school and you can't learn if you go home and you're in a neighborhood with high crime density. You hear gunshots, all sorts of distractions going on. It's very difficult. And until we address those issues and figure out a way to eliminate those barriers to education, we won't see a difference. So,
thank you. I mean, and let's stay with this a little bit because what's fundamental here, I think, in order to transform schools is to get at what the key problems are. Oh, I'm sorry. You're going to tell me about this. So you have to do that. What's fundamental fundamental about what? Yeah, I know you did. I mean, you know, next time. What's fundamental about transforming schools is first having a sense of what the crucial problems are that have to be addressed. So one that's just being surfaced is poverty. I'd like to hear from the other folks around the table and hear what you think about this issue. Go ahead, Dr. Driver.
So in terms of poverty, I don't think it's an issue that's just surfaced. I think it's an issue that people are finally talking about. We're the second poorest city behind Detroit, and this isn't something that happened overnight. And so starting to figure out exactly what that means and what that looks like. If you're talking about young people being in foster care placements, being in homeless situations where they're not having access not only to food but to healthy food, it changes the way that we do our day-to-day business. And so we have parent coordinators that are in our schools this year that are doing everything from finding work for our parents. They're helping them. They're doing cooking lessons, financial literacy, computer literacy, English as a second language to try to help combat some of those barriers that are in place. A number of our partners that are coming to the table now are talking about culturally responsive teaching practices, putting race and class on the table, but also trauma-informed care. It sounds like a buzzword, but in all honesty, this is the reality that we deal in. So it's not enough to just say, or our students have tough situations, but being very specific about what those situations are and how they manifest into the schools. You hear conversations all the time around suspensions and attendance and safety and things of that nature, but many of the challenges that our students face make it very difficult for them to have what we would consider a normal day. And so how do we build those supports, whether it's our social workers, our attendance liaisons, even better equipping our principals and teachers with how you recognize a child that's going through trauma and how we address that. And so that has to be a part of the equation. I think we've put so much emphasis in turnaround work over time, has been so much around reading and math, and trust me, those things are important. But if you don't talk about the other social emotional learning, the aspects that have to go hand in hand with that, that's where we've fallen down. And so I truly believe, one, it's recognizing this issue has been in place for a long time, but also being brave enough to address it simultaneously while we're trying to do all of these things in the schools in isolation.
No, okay.
I'm a rule breaker, so I wasn't going in order. But one thing that I was thinking about is, and this is kind of piggybacking off of what you were talking about, Dr. Driver, is the community engagement piece. So we hear a lot about wraparound services. The wraparound services only work if they are a cohesive unit. And so having wraparound services just placed inside of schools without first thinking about what are the needs of that population of that school, those are futile efforts. And so I think the wraparound services have to be specific to the needs and the population of the schools. I think about myself growing up. I didn't go to a low-performing school, but I definitely grew up in extreme poverty. And so when I went to school, what I was thinking about was, is the next meal coming? Is the electricity going to be on? Is my mother going to be safe? And so we need wraparound services that are answering specific questions for specific children, and not just kind of tagging because it's a good program and it works somewhere else.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because you said your school wasn't low performing, but your home situation was different. Personally, I went to a very low performing high school, very low graduation rate. My home situation was a little bit different. I had two full-time working parents who brought home a decent income. I didn't get everything I wanted, but we weren't, it was still a decent situation, right? Especially relative to the people that I went to school with. And so many times we think, well, I don't want to send my child to this low-performing school. I don't want to send my student here. Just because, a significant number of students in a school aren't performing at that level doesn't mean your student, your child, if given the proper guidance, the proper insights, just everything that they need to succeed, doesn't mean that's going to happen. Because I know people who went to high-performing schools, didn't graduate or graduated and aren't doing much right now. It didn't play a significant role in their outcomes post graduation. Just because I went to a low performing high school didn't mean I wasn't going to graduate. Didn't mean I wasn't going to get the education, because I go back to a lot of my teachers now. I still see them. I still feel that I got a solid education, but so many other students in my class that would have been graduating with me, the problems that they brought to school with them limited them. they didn't have that support. They didn't have those services that were going to make sure that they went home to a safe environment, that were going to make sure that they were going to be deterred from drugs, that were going to make sure that they had something to eat every night. So,
the wraparound schools idea, which I know you've talked pretty extensively about, I think certainly there's place for that because there are some schools in Milwaukee who are doing somewhat some wraparound services. There's a limit to what you can do necessarily. I don't know if you can necessarily provide a medical clinic inside your school and things like that, or a dentist, but those are all factors in the student's learning process. And if that is something that is going to help with education, we certainly should be looking at doing more of that. However, of course, the funding is an issue and how you're going to accomplish that. And I think that as far as the students in poverty areas being able to succeed, as Mandela said here, yeah, certainly they can, just as well as there can be families who have two-parent families and they don't do well. But you're looking at the overall average of what goes on here, and certainly, as we've heard before, you can take that poverty map and you can lay it on top of a map where the low-performing schools are, and it looks pretty similar. So in order to accomplish that, I think it goes back to the basics of education. Of anybody who's been a teacher can tell you that the two most important things in the education of a child are good support at home and great teachers. And if we can accomplish those two things, we're going to be able to accomplish a lot. So if we're going to look into wraparound services, I'd be all in favor of looking into that. But it has to lead, it has to have involvement in that we're going to grow those two key things. There's got to be involvement of parents. We've got to use this kind of a service as getting the parents more engaged in the children's education. That it's not just wraparound for the students, but it's wraparound for the family. And it's not looked at as something that is a permanent arrangement. This is something we want. I think we all would like to get education back to where it once was, in terms of the kids go to school and they go home and parents help them with their homework, and that cycle that so many of us are familiar with. But in order to get there, we can't do it without re-engaging the parents, and we can't do it without having really good teachers.
So one of the things that we're very excited about in MPS is speaks to this need in terms of community support. We're engaging in this process called asset mapping. And basically, it gives us the opportunity to look at every school, determine what programs, what partnerships, what resources are currently in the schools. We did 130 plus budget carousels, meeting with every principal, school support teacher, and parent coordinator to find out what they have, what's needed. So that we're able to start doing, we call it business matching, partnership matching, and really bringing a number of different partners to the table to help us say, okay, now we know what schools have and don't have. Here's what we need to help offset that deficit. And so a number of our partners from business, from the faith-based community, from a number of community organizations have reached out to us to say, we want to help you close these gaps. And we have an opportunity in Milwaukee if we stick together and we continue to concentrate our resources together to be able to bring those services and those programs to our young people who need them.
Yeah, I was thinking, while I appreciate the point of the wraparound services for families, at the end of the day, what we can control as educators is what's happening in the school. And I'd say that coming, again, from a pretty broken home and not having all of those resources and not having the supports at home, but still being able to, I think, be pretty successful in my career in life. But I do think that there's some necessity to match, again, kind of what I was saying earlier, match what's available in the community with the needs of the school. And I don't think it has to be 18 services. It could be 2 really great services based on the needs of the school, based on the needs of those students.
I think I'm hearing actually a whole lot more consensus than I had anticipated, but let me see if I can push this in a non-consensus way for a second. Arguably, regardless of the conditions outside of schools, there's some schools that are just terrible. Should we close them down, turn them into charters, or vouchers.
I got to push back there. I mean, you got to look at the.
What's the question?
We got to look at the reasons why that school is considered terrible. Like,
okay.
Honestly, I mean, what makes that school terrible? Like, what makes it? Behavior issues? Is it academic issues? How do we? We're not talking about the individual student that makes up the overall achievement of that entire school. Until we look at those individual students, you can't call an entire school terrible, right? Like, if I look back, my school, I could easily say, John Marshall High School, class 2003. What a terrible crop of students. What a terrible school. That school is awful. That's easy to say, and that's what so often we find ourselves in the easy way of just blaming, right? We just say, oh yeah, I'll just castigate this entire school. We'll just say this is awful without saying, okay, well, let's take a deeper look. Let's see, why is this school terrible? Why are these students failing? Why are these students not graduating? And I tell people all the time, like when I look for my classmates from school, I can see about as many of them on CCAP as I can on Facebook. And why is that the case? And you look and you say, the performance of Milwaukee Public Schools, does it contribute to the economic status of the city right now? We're in dire straits. Is it because of the way that Milwaukee Public Schools educates? Well, we got to look at it the other way around. Is the economic condition in the city of Milwaukee a contributing factor to the low performance of Milwaukee Public Schools? And honestly, we have to. As terrible as the economic situation is in a neighborhood, is as terrible as the school is going to be.
Okay, yeah, definitely want to hear responses.
I think there are things that can be done. I don't know that shutting schools down is the answer. We've had that debate. I mean, there are federal turnaround models that suggest that's that exact sort of thing. But I think that you can have two schools in a community that have students that have essentially the same socioeconomic background, and one is doing pretty well and one is not. And you need to get at the heart of the matter is why is that? And it could be a number of issues. And we have those schools in Milwaukee where we have some that are doing really well and some that are not. Why is that? Poverty certainly is part of the issue. But as you said, there are certain things schools just can't do. And if we're going to have schools that are going to serve their students better than they currently are, there has to be a way to figure out to make that better in spite of all those issues that there are. It certainly is difficult, but that's what we're searching for is, we can't necessarily easily solve the poverty issue. There's been poverty since the beginning of time, but there must be something that can be done to reach those students on a higher level than what we are right now.
All right.
I was just going to say, I think there's a difference between blaming and naming. I don't think the intent here is blaming, but I do think we have to name. When a school has 2 and 3% proficiency in reading and math, we have to say that is not okay. We have to name that school is failing. We have to name that school in its current condition is terrible for children. If it's not a school, and this is my measure, if it's not a school that's good enough for me to send my own 2 children to, then it's probably not a great school. So I think that's one piece, is being comfortable with naming that it's not a great school. We also have to get uncomfortable with the disproportionate range of poverty in our city. I'm not sure that I believe that we can have 2 schools in the same exact neighborhood, and maybe there's some data to suggest that there is, where they're performing markedly different, because poverty is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing, and these schools didn't become terrible overnight, so we're not going to fix them overnight.
And so a few pieces that I wanted to add, we actually do have schools that you can compare side by side in the same neighborhood where one's performing better than others. And it is because of the things that I mentioned when I first started about what makes a good school, and concentrated efforts from leadership, partnerships with the surrounding community, and teachers that are committed to building student engagement and student learning. So it is happening every day in MPS. I'd be glad to take you on a tour of those schools if you'd like to see them. But I think what's also important here, it's very easy to say that a solution is just to close them and reopen them as a charter school or a choice school. We've had choice schools for 20 years. They're performing lower than MPS. And it's something we don't talk about enough. So it's a waste of effort to think that, the quick fix is just to turn us over into a charter, turn us over into a choice school, when you still have other issues. When you talk about good instruction, when you want to make sure that you have viable communities, we don't talk about, we have one of the poorest zip codes in the country right around the corner. And if we don't, the highest mass incarceration rates, I know I'm leaving out another one of those horrible statistics. fix. But I truly think that just thinking if you can just close it and reopen it, and you're just going to start over, that you're going to fix the problem, you're not. You're just trying to delay what is inevitable if we don't start getting real about what's happening in our schools. We have to engage our young people. We have to find out what is relevant and meaningful for them. We're in a city where they don't have enough evidence that investing in their education is going to yield them some kind of positive outcomes and results. I think all the time, would I be in this chair if I went to Milwaukee Public Schools, if I went to any school in southeastern Wisconsin or in the state of Wisconsin? I have to ask myself that question all the time because we don't get real about what is happening in our schools. So we can't go to the quick fix. It might sound great and exciting, but that's not going to get us to what's really happening in our schools. And so I just beg everyone, please don't go to what sounds sexy, and let's look at the data, because there's plenty of evidence that says, the voucher program has not worked for all of our schools. And let's start working on what is working in our schools. I'm sitting next to April, we're doing work together at Carver Academy, and that's been 2 years in the making. This was a school that was slated to close. And now, because of the partnerships of 5 different organizations coming together and saying, no, we're going to make a difference for these young people, we're starting to see those results. We have the GE program. We have schools, again, bottom of the list, who are now starting to make considerable gains. They're right down the street in places that you wouldn't expect it. It is possible, but we have to focus on teaching and learning and making sure that our students are successful, that they can be connected to something that's relevant and meaningful when they're done with education, and not just keep arguing about the model of delivery. But let's get real about what we can actually do for our young people.
I want to add one thing, because I appreciate you bringing up the fact of, there are schools with students with identical economic, conditions at the home, and one student may outperform the other. So let's look at a school with a 70% graduation rate, right? It's like, yeah, that's what we consider a terrible school, right? If it had a 70% graduation rate, would that be a school that we consider terrible?
Certainly room for improvement.
Certainly room for improvement. But the fact is, 70% of those students are graduating. What is the disconnect? What is the difference between the 70 and the 30? And how are the 70% of students somehow able to make it out of this terrible school? And when you look at, when you look at reading proficiency, one thing we should always challenge ourselves to do is to go a little bit deeper, right? Because there was a school, can't think of the name of it, but they had low reading proficiency, very low. And I want to say Wisconsin Vision happened to come in, and they did eye exams for students. And there was an almost identical percentage of students with poor vision as percentage of students who couldn't read. So the fact is, these students, it's not even that they couldn't read, they just couldn't see. Had they been able to see, they probably could read. And that's an example that I use all the time, because it's an example of us needing to dig a little bit deeper to figure out what's going on. Why is it this low? Like, when things are low, yeah, it's a cause for alarm. We got to do something. But why is it that low? It shouldn't be that bad. There's no reason on earth. And typically, when it's that bad, there's something else lingering that we haven't taken into account.
I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is the importance of leadership in schools and common best practices. So I would venture to guess that in the schools that you just talked about, Dr. Driver, that there's strong leadership in those schools. There are strong data practices that are not just testing students to be testing them, but testing them so that decisions can be informed, and not over-testing them and having space to actually teach in between those assessments. I would venture to guess that there are systems and routines in place for how behavior and the culture of the school is set. I would venture to guess that there is some formal way of engaging not just the parent community, but the community at large, and those wraparound services. But I do think one piece that we are missing in this conversation is the focus on really solid leadership and common best practices across not just schools that are being turned around, if we will, but also schools that are just high performing.
Just for a second, could you speak to that a little bit more? How do you develop stronger leadership in schools? I know that that's work that you're involved with a lot.
Yeah, obviously I can personally talk about it since that's my work every day. So we, through our partnership, and I'll kind of focus on Carver, through our partnership, goes side by side with the school leader. So schools at Milwaukee, our model is improve school leaders, and they will in turn improve their schools. So what that looks like is, Janelle Hawkins, the principal, has termed what she calls the twinciple model, and we joke about that. But essentially, she has another set of eyes and ears in her coaches at schools that can Milwaukee, but not just with STCM. She also has partners with City Ears. She has partners with Teach for America. She has the support of the district. And what Northwestern Mutual, thanks Darren, and Northwestern Mutual to make sure that we're looking at the school through multiple lenses, again, identifying the needs within each of our buckets, but working as a collective unit. I want to go back to that point that putting wraparound services in a school alone without having a collective unit is just a waste of time and resources. So we look at and support what are the blind spots that leader may have. We don't have leaders who wake up each day thinking, I'm going to go to school and be a terrible leader. We have leaders who wake up each day thinking, I'm going to go do the best thing that I can do for kids, but every professional has blind spots, so our support is helping leaders see their blind spots and developing those by looking at best practices across the country at high-performing schools and helping those leaders to implement those best practices.
And the one piece that I'll add in terms of what we do as a district, we have an institute model. Basically, it's designed for our principals. One of the things I wanted to speak to, I don't want to go through every single thing that we do every month, but we do have an educator effectiveness model for leadership that we've instituted in MPS, and we develop school networks. So whether it's high schools, STEM schools, art schools, language immersion schools that come together twice a month to talk about best practices. They do walkthroughs together in schools, and they're able to apply what they're learning around the Common Core, around educator effectiveness, around trauma-informed care, and actually real-time being able to see it taking place in the classroom, and then coming back and sharing together, okay, what did you see that worked well, what didn't, how do we move forward? We also have a number of coaches that support our principals, our newer leaders from Alverno, but then for our veteran leaders, they receive support from regional superintendents and from directors of school support, but strongly encourage sharing of best practices across different groups of principals, but also we have a number of our business partners who have offered executive coaching for us, because it is helpful to think about things from different perspectives as we develop our own leadership philosophy. And so that's something that we're very excited about moving forward in terms of continuing to develop our principals and our assistant principals.
Schools That Can Milwaukee is an example of what you said about organizations that can come in and help you with that leadership in your school. The mentoring program, matching up principals from one school to another school, a veteran principal with perhaps a new principal, to be able to understand the things it is that's necessary to make a school operate successfully. But as I get back to something I said earlier, one of the signs of a good school is you have teachers who want to teach there. You have principals who want to be there. And the key to that is that they're going to be backed up by the parents of the students in those schools, that when they take actions, the parents are going to be there with the principal saying, yes, these are the moves that need to be made. And sometimes there are difficult moves that need to be made. And that's one of the things I think that is lacking sometimes in our more difficult schools that we have that don't seem to be succeeding at the level we want. I don't like using the term terrible school. I don't like using the term failing school, because every school you've got out there, there are bright lights here. We need to have a lot more of those bright lights of people who are doing really good things. They just need to be supported. And if we can provide those supports for them, we can put a whole bunch more lights in that school.
So can we conclude then that there really should be no basis for closing schools? That there are schools that need support, but they have strengths, they have possibilities, and with the appropriate amount of support, they can thrive. Would that be something people would agree with, that there is no reason to close down a school?
Let me just jump in, since that was a provision of the accountability bill. Is that I don't think that you take it off the table necessarily, because there may be circumstances where it's appropriate, but it should be rare, very rare, that something like that would happen. And I think it needs to have the backing of the community as well, that you need to make a radical change such as that.
I think it's very damaging when we get to a place that closes schools. You ask anybody that's a homeowner, and I don't think that they would be in favor of closing any school at any given moment. But when I'll get back to the leadership portion, and it just requires thinking outside of the box, just doing something different. And make no mistake about it, we are in a pretty bad situation right now. Our outcomes aren't what we want them to be, or whatever factors you want to include into that assessment. The fact remains that we are not in a desirable situation when it comes to education, and I can admit as much. However, if our leaders in our schools are able to pool resources that haven't been traditional partners in the educational process, is where we can have some of those transformative outcomes. If they can pull in, community organizations, the business community, whoever really wants to take part in what's going on, who truly wants to see a better outcome for the school, including neighbors. Parents are the centerpiece. It's the focal point of the entire process. When the parents are involved, you typically see better outcomes. And again, it can't just be parents. It has to be so much more, because the situation is that bleak at this moment. But when you take a different approach, again, forming as many partnerships, and we can't do it alone. You can't, again, because the school cannot do all these things that we now need schools to do. A teacher can't be a social worker and a teacher and a nurse. We got to have as many people who can contribute to an individual student as possible.
Yeah, I just want to make sure for clarification, because there are times, unfortunately, when you do have to close schools that are outside of this conversation per se, in terms of performance, in terms of, we have some buildings that are over 100 years old and things like that. So I just want to make sure that is clear. Because I'm looking at some of my fellow colleagues in the audience, there's a difference there. But I think we have to always, put our students and their families at the front of this conversation. All too often, they're after we've already decided what we're going to do. And so I think trying to figure out ways that we can work together to try to change outcomes in the school. But with that, it does have to happen outside of the community. I've changed my own philosophy. I think we are in control of, we have to be in control of all those things. We haven't been given an option. And so we have to think hand in hand with what's happening in the community, the circumstances that our young people are facing, as well as the things that we're able to do in the 8 hours that we have them.
Well, this is just a great, thoughtful conversation. I really appreciate being able to learn from you. We have a little bit of time left, and I'd like to open this up for questions, because these issues are just so powerful. Please.
Dr. Driver, I don't know if I did not hear you correctly. I know you mentioned that sub-charter schools are not doing as well as some MPS schools, but I guess I did not hear you more or less say that charter schools the charter schools will continue to be a part of the educational option, not only for MPS, because you do have charters, but also with the city of Milwaukee and UWM. So in a way, you do still support charters, or you do not support charter schools?
So the question was around my position on charter schools. So they're a very important part of our portfolio in MPS. We have instrumentality charter schools, and we have non-instrumentality charter schools. So we continue to have charters in our district, and that's something that I think is very important in terms of the portfolio that we have. What I was speaking about specifically as a collective group were our voucher schools. There was a report published by the Public Policy Forum in December that actually, as a collective, they were performing lower than Milwaukee Public Schools. And so my comment was basically saying, if we're trying to find solutions for low-performing schools, to simply close them and reopen them as a choice school when that hasn't proved to be an effective strategy in Milwaukee over time, I think is misguided.
Questions? Sir?
We talked about some failing schools or schools in trouble, but throughout Milwaukee there are some really good schools. And 4 colleagues and I from UWM have spent a couple of years doing research on those schools. One of our findings is that every one of the successful schools has a pervasively integrated character education program. And my question to each of you is, where do you see character education as part of a change strategy that allows teachers to teach and kids to learn in these schools that are troubled and throughout MPS?
I think character education has to be one of the foundational pieces of changing low-performing schools into higher-performing schools. I think that for a couple of reasons. One of the things I stated earlier is we can control what's happening within the walls of those 8 hours. I think Dr. Driver just mentioned that as well. So by building and having a very strong character education program, we can teach children even if they live in poverty, that here's how you deal with conflict, here's how you show grit, here's how you show perseverance, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of whether that circumstance is within the school building or outside of the school building. I also think that we need to ask ourselves, and this is, I think Representative Barnes, you talked about this a little bit earlier, we have to ask ourselves, why are families and parents not engaged at the schools? And I think we would have to look at the historical context and the historical relationship between families living in poverty and the school. There's often mistrust between those. And so I think building character education from within can actually bridge some of that conversation with families.
For me, in thinking about character education, I think it's twofold. And so how we define it is very important. We tend to try to place middle-class values on our students, and we don't think about meeting them where they are and bringing their life experiences to the table and validating those experiences before we try to impart what we think is important. I think what teachers need and what students need is some way, the tools to be able to say, these are your life experiences. Some may be good, some may be bad, but these are the qualities and characteristics you're going to need to be able to deal with them and overcome them, and to find ways to be successful. So I take slight pause when I hear character education, only because we have to be so careful not to offend but to empower, and figure out ways while we're trying to teach what we know to be a positive strategy or good character. It's also validating what they see as good character and finding that happy medium to make sure that they can be successful.
I appreciate you bringing up that point. You would not be able to convince me that a child who grows up in poverty doesn't already have perseverance. And they may not be able to name it that, but I think what's missing is the common language to have that dialogue between the school and students. So thanks for that.
I was just going to say, with the character piece, we have an environment that welcomes students, that makes students happy to be there. I think that's an important piece and helps to build that character, because sometimes that's the only place they ever will feel welcome.
In the back? Oh, yes, you. Yeah. Not even. Yeah.
About what the relative importance of leadership stability is in improving these lower performance schools, and whether there's incentives in the district to keep a principal who's had success somewhere there instead of having incentives to move out.
The question was around stability and leadership and how important it is. So, to quote one of my mentors, leadership is everything. That stability really is mission critical, as well as having stability with your teaching team. The reality is, in doing the work and facing the challenges that often come in some of our historically low-performing schools, is that burnout happens very quickly. And so, in terms of ways that we try to provide support, again, through the networks that we have, we do have our Commitment Schools grants. It's they're not large grants, but it's $300,000 every year perpetually for the next 3 years for those schools that we've deemed, as some of our lowest performing, to give them the supports that are necessary. Also involves a great deal of coaching that goes on. April spoke to the work that's happening with schools that can, and actually pairing up our principals, because you need support in this work. I know I can speak for myself. I'm a member of the Council of the Great City Schools, and so there are 67 other districts that are dealing with the same issues I'm dealing with every day. And so having that support system, being able to share some best practices from things that they're doing around the country and trying to bring those into the work that I do in Milwaukee is all part of the equation in terms of having strong leadership, listening to best practices, and getting those positive outcomes.
If I could just add, one of the things that I think makes our work unique is the cross-sector approach to our work. So we work with traditional public, charter public, and voucher private schools. But one of the things that is amazing about that work is that the best practices don't have to stay, from MPS, don't have to stay within MPS. Those best practices can be shared across the sectors, because ultimately our goal is to make our city better, right? It's not just to make one of those sectors better, it's to make all of our cities better. Or make our whole city better, and vice versa.
I think one of the challenges in any kind of leadership position is for your organization to not be viewed as a stepping stone to whatever the next job would be. Unfortunately, when you have schools that are really tough to teach in, that is oftentimes how it is viewed. And so what we need to do is we need to find ways to encourage those principals, those teachers who have every capability of teaching in those schools, to be willing to teach in those schools, and if they're already there, to stay there, to see the value in staying there. Those are the answers that we are searching for, and that part of that, I think you can't get away from the fact that part of that is there has to be enough resources to be able to do it.
Let me ask the last question. What should be and what will be the state role in dealing with low-performing schools? It's obviously an issue that's kind of bollocked up the legislature so far this session.
I guess that's you and I.
I mean, shameless plug. I mean, I've introduced a Sustainable Community Schools Act bill, right? I think it's important for the state to be able to help those schools that want to increase their performance. Should be able to get them the resources that they need to help. Whether it's money from DPI to say, hey, all right, well, let's fund you if you come up with a plan. Because there should always be a plan first. And unfortunately, there isn't always a plan. There's an idea, but it doesn't come with a set of steps to actually meet certain goals. So if we can get our schools that are challenged to say, all right, yeah, well, we want to figure out, we're going to get X amount of parents involved, we're going to get X amount of organizations involved, we're going to get X amount of small private entities involved, and we're going to make this school work because we're going to meet every barrier that every student has to a proper education. We're going to make sure that these students are fed. We're going to make sure that students have access to health care. We're going to make sure that students have all the resources that they need. So there's no reason. We want to create an environment where there's no excuse for a student to not be able to learn. So the state has a significant role in that, and we have to be able, they always say, well, it's the funding. Well, the money's there. We've been spending it irresponsibly for a very long time.
I agree. The state certainly has a role. That's constitutionally, local school boards are essentially a local unit of government, and ultimate responsibility for that lies at the state level, no different than cities, villages, and towns. But what you, I'm sure, can recognize is that the point that the state steps in is when there is clearly a problem, or at least a perception of a problem. And I think that's appropriate, that's when the state should step in. Because I can assure you the state would just love it if all the schools taught students well and didn't have to stick their nose in any way at all. That would be the ultimate goal. But when there are problems, the state has a responsibility to play a role in it. And sometimes there's overreach, no question about that. But the goal ultimately is to, at least in this particular instance, to make our schools serve the students and the parents as best as they possibly can.
Okay. I would have loved to have the legislature all here to hear this conversation because it's been terrific. Thank you all so much.
Yes, Representative Barnes, Representative Thiesfeld, April Knox, Dr. Driver, and Professor Bob Lowe. Thank you for being part of this. We have had excellent, involved, deeply caring, and smart people here, and I'm talking about the audience. I'm talking about all of you that you have done us an honor by being here and being part of this. And that is at least as true and more true for all the people who have been up on this stage. So thank you to everyone who's been part of this. I want to add a thank you to Dean Joseph D. Kearney and Dean Bill Hank of the Marquette Law School and Dean Bill Hank of the College of Education for being the ones who stand behind allowing us to do these programs. This is a successful program if we've had a lot of intelligent, serious conversation, some of it crossing lines not often covered, but it's only really successful if this is part of a continuing process of having such conversations. So I encourage all of you to, as Jeff Spence said for many years at Milwaukee School Board's meetings, to go forth and do great things. And we're eager to continue to help conversations of this kind occur. Thank you very much all for being here.